In this video, we're going to build our own invoice and expense tracking app just like QuickBooks without writing a single line of code using a tool called Bubble. Now, before I say another word, let me show you a quick preview of exactly what we're going to build today. Over in a preview of my QuickBooks clone here, the first thing you'll notice is that on my home page, I built out this dashboard where you can see a visualization of all of the data for my own business. So at the top of the page here, I can track all of the invoices that I've sent out, and I can see that they've all been paid. I can also track all of my expenses by their categories. And if you really wanted, you could filter these by a date range as well. Now, another thing I should point out about our app today is, of course, it goes without saying that it's going to be fully responsive across both mobile and desktop devices. So as you can see, when the browser shrinks, we have this mobile drop-down menu, so we can access all of these same menu options as we saw on desktop. Back on the main view though, what I'm interested in showing you is the rest of the core features we're going to create today. So firstly, what we're going to do is build out a way to create a CRM for each business. So when we click on this customers tab here, you'll see a list of all of the customers that a business has added to their books. And you can choose to filter these down by a particular customer name, or if you wanted, you could create a new entry to store in your database. Then from here, once you've been able to add new customers, you could of course create and send them invoices. So if I just close this pop-up, I'm going to select on my invoices tab. And at this point in time, you can see I've created one invoice. But what I'd like to do is create another invoice. So I'm going to open up this drop-down menu here, choose to create an invoice, and it's going to display yet another pop-up. Now for this invoice, I'll just need to add in all of the details about the customer that I want to send it to. So I can type in the company name. It'll automatically pull the email address for my contact at that company. And then I can just add in some additional values. So things like the invoice date, when this is due, and even the invoice number. Finally, if we then scroll down, we can add all of the items to this invoice. So let's say I provided some consulting services to this particular customer. What I'm going to do is just add in all of the details for one particular service. So in this example, I've said that I've done some UX UI design work. I've just added some dummy text in my description, but it took me 8 hours and my rate was $100 an hour. I'm then going to add this to my overall invoice. And as you'll see, it'll add that as a line item. But what I'm going to do is also add another service that I offered. And for this service, it's just going to be something like SEO strategy. I'm then going to add this line item to that invoice. And as you'll now see, we've got a nice list of all of the services I offered. And of course, this can also be applicable to if you're selling products. And then at the bottom, we have our grand total. And they're going to choose to save this invoice. It's going to generate a version of that in our database and then send us through to a page where we can view all of the details for this specific invoice. So this is the page where we can view the full invoice. Now, right now, as you can see, this invoice is currently unpaid. But on this, it's got the details of my company, so the company that created this invoice. It's got the details of the customer, as well as, of course, some of the details about things like when it's due. We also have our line items here. And let's say what I'd like to do from here is actually send this invoice to my customer. If I click this button, what it's going to do is generate a PDF preview of that invoice. Then once that's loaded, it's going to display it as a preview here. You can choose to download this if you would like. And look, that'll allow you to view it as a standard PDF. But what I'd like to do is now send it to my customer through an email. So I'm just going to add a subject here. I'm going to say your January invoice. And then I'll just add some dummy text in the body here. I'll send that to my customer. And of course, that will send that to them in an email. Now look, over in a separate tab, this is just a quick preview of what that email is going to look like. It's nothing too fancy, but when your customer clicks on this link, it's going to take them back to that invoice page where they can make a payment to that invoice. So when your customer comes back to this page, they're going to be able to select this button and choose to make a payment. And when they click on this, it's going to open up a Stripe checkout. So that way they can easily add in their credit card details. So this is that Stripe checkout that your customers are going to interact with. So on this page, I can see the invoice number, the total amount, and also the logo of the business that I'm paying this invoice to. I'm going to choose to pay this here. It's going to process that transaction and then send me back through to my Bubble page. And now what you'll notice is that at the top of my invoice, the status of this has been updated to paid. Now look, these are just a few of the main core features that we're going to build out within our QuickBooks clone today. But we also have the ability to do things like track expenses. So similar to the process of creating an invoice, you can create a new expense. And if you ever want to view that expense, you can just click on the entry within our list here. And look, you'll see all of its details. And look, finally, another important feature that I just wanted to quickly highlight is being able to manage your team as the owner of a business. So on my settings page here, I can not only update my own personal details, my company's details, but what you'll see is the ability to invite and manage my team members. So if I wanted to add a new team member, I'd select this option, add their details in, and send them an invite. And of course, that would send them an email with access to my company inside of QuickBooks. And if I really wanted, I could update their permission or even remove them from my team. Now, look, this is just a small subset of the total features that we're going to build out today. There's still so much happening behind the scenes that I can't wait to show you. If you've ever tried to build your own app or startup, I'm sure you know firsthand just how complicated the process can be. If you're anything like me and you don't know how to code, your options are quite limited. You can either try and source a technical co-founder, or you can pay a developer to build the app for you. Now, look, when it comes to paying someone to build an app using traditional code, I hope you're ready to make the choice between paying your first home deposit or building out a basic MVP. Now, look, if none of these options seem suitable for you, don't stress. That's exactly what I'm here to help with today. If you don't know how to code, Bubble is going to be your new best friend on your startup journey. Bubble is what's known as a no-code tool, which in simple terms just means that you can create fully functional apps without having to write a single line of code. Using Bubble, I've been able to create absolutely any app you could imagine under the sun. So things like marketplaces, ride-sharing apps, meal delivery apps, matchmaking apps, and the list truly just goes on. While there are plenty of no-code tools that can help with certain parts of the app development process, Bubble is a full-stack solution. It allows you to not only design the interface of your app, stitch everything together using visual workflows, store data directly in your own database, and of course, integrate with third-party tools and services. Now look, each one of these things would be a standalone no-code product. So it's truly insane to me that Bubble includes all of that in one single tool. Damn! Now look, today, our focus is creating our own custom accounting tool, kind of like QuickBooks. But if you've ever looked at the real-world QuickBooks app lately, you'll see how easy it is to get overwhelmed. Look, there are just so many features in that I just won't have time to cover. But today, my main priority is building out 4 main features. We're going to build out our own custom CRM inside of QuickBooks, so that way a business can manage all of their customers. We're then going to create a way to track expenses, create new invoices, and send those invoices to customers as PDFs. And then finally, we're going to build out a data visualization feature, which is just going to allow us to display all of the information about a business in one single place. Now look, at this point in time, I've truly rambled on for long enough. Let's grab our Bubble editor and we can dive right into it. Within our tutorial today, the first thing I wanted to do wasn't creating any core customer-facing features. Instead, what I wanted to do is take the time to set up and configure our own custom database, which is going to power the rest of our QuickBooks clone. Now, if you are brand new to Bubble, the process of setting up a database can seem quite overwhelming, and don't worry, I completely get it. It was for me too when I first got started. But look, it is your boy's job here today to make things as easy as possible for you, which is why I've actually created this checklist of everything we're about to add into our database. And look, I didn't just stop there. I also have created a long list of all of the features that we're going to add into our QuickBooks clone. And as you can see, this is quite extensive. Now, throughout my QuickBooks clone today, I'm going to focus on just a couple of key areas. QuickBooks is truly a huge product. So today I'm going to focus on building out a custom CRM where you can store customers. I'm also going to create an expense tracking feature, an invoicing feature, and a data visualization feature. So that way you can visualize all of the data that's happening inside of your QuickBooks account. So by all means, there is a lot of features from the real world QuickBooks product that you might not see in this tutorial. But today, I just want to focus on building a great piece of accounting software that you can create yourself or even create and start selling to customers. Now, if we scroll onto the top of my checklist here, what I'd like to do is walk you through how we're going to set up our database. And look, I'll also be sure to include a link to this checklist in the description of this video. So that way you can make a copy of this and check each item off as we add it into our Bubble editor. Now, for our checklist, I personally just use a tool called Notion. It's a great documentation tool, and my whole life revolves around Notion. But once you get access to this, you should be able to create a duplicate version of this so you can follow along. And now to the good part, and that is talking about databases. When it comes to building out databases in Bubble, there are 2 key terms you need to understand. And that is, first of all, data types and data fields. Now, what is the difference between these 2 things? As you'll see in my checklist here, I have these headings above each of my checklist items. These are known as my data types, and all of the checklist items are known as my data fields. So a data type is an overall thing that you're going to create in your database. It's an entity, I guess you could say. And before I ever open up a Bubble editor, I actually like to sit down and take some time and reflect on what type of data I need to store within my app. So if we were building a QuickBooks clone today, or a piece of accounting software, you just need to recognize what information is going to come in and flow through your app. And more importantly, what information do you want your users to be able to create? So the way I like to think of data types is if a user ever needs to create something inside of your app, that should be a data type. So for instance, let's walk through the data types that I have here. First of all, there's a user data type because of course, a user is going to sign up and create a new account. So every single time they do that, I want to be able to create a new entry in my database for every single user. Then there's my business data type. So if a user wants to register an account and of course create a company for our QuickBooks clone, they're going to have to create a new business in our database. Then there's our customer. So within a business, if you have a CRM of all of your customers, you're going to need to be able to create new customers. And so you can see the trend here. Whenever a user needs to create something, as I said, that is its own data type. And then when it comes to the data fields, that's essentially just all of the information you'll need to store within each entry. So a great example here is under my user data type. So every single time someone creates an account, I'm going to need to store some information about that person. So there's things like their name, their profile photo, the company that they work for, their account type. So are they an admin or are they just something like a bookkeeper? Then for every business that's created, we'd also want to store things like the company name, the logo, the website, the phone number, and so on. You get the idea. So data types are your overall things, and data fields are kind of like the information within those overall things. And when it comes to building out your database, the first thing you'll need to do is add your data types into Bubble. So let's open up our Bubble editor here, and look, I'm going to walk you through every single data type and field as I add it in, and I'm going to give you an in-depth explanation. But what we need to do first is open up our data tab, and what you'll notice here is that this is kind of broken down into two separate sections. So right here it says the word data types, which is just what I've been harping on about for the last 5 minutes. So on the left-hand side here, you'll see a list of all of your data types. And by default, what you might notice is that there is a pre-created user data type. And the reason why this data type has been created by default is of course because if someone needs to actually use your app, they need to sign in and create an account. So that's why Bubble adds this automatically inside of any app you create. Now on the right-hand side here, we have all of our data fields. So this is all of that information that's stored under each user. And by default, you're going to have some information about an email and a password. So of course, whenever someone signs up an account, they need an email and a password. And so that's why you have these default fields inside of your user data type. Now you won't be able to see the password field, that has been hidden for privacy reasons, but it does exist. And so what I want to do right now before I build out any of my data fields is actually create all of my data types. So if we jump back into my Notion checklist, we've already added in our user data type. So the next one is going to be a business. So as I mentioned, the purpose of this business data type is that when a user creates their account, if they're an owner of a business, they should be able to create a business inside of our QuickBooks clone. And that business is going to be the central data piece for inviting team members to participate in that, or attaching customers within a particular business. So this data type is very essential. So I'm going to create this here. I'll then jump back into Notion and I can see the next data type is our customer data type. So within each business, someone should be able to create customers that belong to that business. So that way, when you're creating invoices later on, you can easily identify who you want to send that invoice to. So I'm going to jump into Bubble. We're going to create a data type known as the customer. I'll then jump back into Notion. Then we've got our expenses. So I guess one of the core features within my QuickBooks clone today is being able to track expenses. So every single time you, let's say, make a purchase from a store, or you have a software subscription, or you purchase some consulting services, you'll need to be able to add that as an expense to your business. And so when you're adding that expense to your business, you're creating a new expense in your database, which is why I have this as its own data type. So I'm going to add in a new data type here called the expense, but it doesn't end just there. What you'll notice is that I have a separate data type known as the expense item. So the way I've structured my QuickBooks clone today is that for every expense inside of that, you can have multiple items. So let's say you were to go to a place like Walmart and you purchase some office supplies. If you bought some pens, a stapler, and some paper clips, each of those 3 things would be their own item. So I want to be able to create an entry in my database for each of those items. And the reason for that is because for every item, I want to be able to categorize it. I want to be able to add a cost to it, a description to it. And then what we can do later on, and I'm going to walk through this when we get to that part of our tutorial, is actually add multiple expense items into one expense. So for one big expense, so for one shopping trip to Walmart, we can have our 3 expense items, and we can then calculate the total cost of all of those items put together. So that's what the purpose of this expense item data type is. So we're going to jump into Bubble here, and we're going to type in expense item, and we'll add that in. We'll then jump back into Notion, scroll on down, and as you'll see, the next data type is our invoice, because of course that's a pretty core feature in our QuickBooks clone. I want to be able to allow my customers to create and send an invoice to a customer. So that's pretty self-explanatory. So I'm going to jump into Bubble and create a data type called invoice. And then from here back in Notion, what you'll notice is that I have another data type, and this is kind of similar to the expense items. This is going to be an invoice item. And look, the purpose of this data type is the exact same as the previous expense items. So within one invoice, you might invoice out multiple items. So let's say if I'm a creative agency and I want to send an invoice to a customer, and within that invoice, I've done work across multiple different areas. So let's say I've done some consulting and strategy planning. I've done some digital marketing, so some SEO, maybe some paid ads. And then I've also done some design work for them, whether it be graphic design or UX UI design. So once again, these are 3 separate items here that I need to add onto the one invoice. So I essentially just want to be able to create those as line items on the invoice that can clearly represent where the total cost of that invoice is coming from. So once again, an overall invoice will be able to contain multiple invoice items. So if I jump into Bubble here, I'm going to create a data type called invoice item. And one thing I should point out is that when it comes to your data types, these should pretty much under no circumstances be a plural. And so what do I mean by that? If I was to call this invoice items, it's going to be quite misleading later on. And you shouldn't use a plural because although in your database, you will have multiple invoice items, when you create an invoice item, you will only create one at a time. You're not going to create items at once. And so if you were to put a plural on this, as you'll see later on throughout our tutorial, it will get quite confusing. So please, please, please do not use a plural when it comes to your data types. Look, there are a few exceptions to that rule, but within my tutorial today, there are no exceptions to that rule. So please don't use a plural. And look, if we jump back into Notion, that is all of the data types that I need to add in. But before I build out all of my data fields, there's one last thing I need to touch base on. And just when you thought you were starting to grasp the concept of building out a database, I'm about to throw another curveball into the mix. And that is by introducing the concept of option sets. So if we scroll all the way down here, you'll see I've created this additional list here called option sets. Now, if you're brand new to Bubble, what the hell are option sets? That is a great question. Option sets are like data types that only you as the admin of your app can create. So what on earth does that actually mean in plain English? So remember how I mentioned that when it comes to data types, you should create a data type for everything that your users are going to create inside of your app. But what about the things that you as the admin only need to create and you don't want your users to create? And so what's a good example of that? Let's talk about our expense categories here. So every single time a customer creates an overall expense or an expense item, what I'd like them to do is to be able to categorize that. So is it related to transport, marketing? Is it office supplies? And when it comes to these categories, I don't want them to be able to type in whatever category they want. I want to have some control over that. So I want them to select from a pre-vetted list that I have created and only I as the admin of my app can control. And so what are the benefits of that? If I was to select all of the categories that someone can choose from, it's going to make sure that our users can't type in their own categories. Now, while that might seem like a restriction, trust me, it's going to be a blessing. Because when your users type in categories, there's no guaranteeing that, first of all, they're going to spell them correctly. Trust me, you'd be surprised. And also, they're not going to format them in the exact same way. So for instance, your user might add a category called transport, and it might be spelled beautifully like this. But then another member of their team might come along and type in the word transport, but it might not have a capital T, it might have a lowercase t. Technically, those are two separate categories now. They're not the exact same thing. In software, things need to be absolutely identical in order for them to have a match. So the word transport with a lowercase is not the same as the word transport with an uppercase. And so this is what I mean about wanting to have control over the data types or things that you can create in your database. Now look, option sets are a slightly more advanced feature, but look, I assure you, I wouldn't introduce this concept if we didn't absolutely need to use it within our tutorial today. So these are important. But thankfully, with option sets, what you're essentially doing is just creating some pre-vetted data in your database that, as I mentioned, your customers will not be able to add or change. And I'm only going to use it in two scenarios today. There's our expense categories, which is what I've just covered, but then there's also the account types. So every single time someone signs up for an account, I only want to give them the option of two choices. They can either be a bookkeeper or an admin. If it was up to users, they'd say that they want to be a super admin, or they'd want to have some sort of permissions that they shouldn't have. And so by using an option set, it allows me to just create more control over my app and consistency. And if you really want to get technical, it's just a way of creating structured data. So because all of this data is always going to be the exact same, so it's going to be spelt the same, formatted the same, and it will always look the same, that is now structured data. But look, the reason I'm talking about option sets before we add in all of our data fields here is because our data fields are actually going to link to our option sets. So for instance, when we build out the data field under our expense item to store a category for that particular item, I'm going to need to link that to this list that I've just created. So that way someone can select from one of these pre-vetted options that I've added into my database. So what we need to do is actually add these option sets in right now. So we're going to jump into Bubble, and over in our data tab, you might notice this menu option called option sets. Now, there's also this great tutorial here by Bubble that I'd recommend watching if the example I just gave you went straight over your head. Trust me, my feelings won't be hurt if you still have to watch this tutorial. But for now, I'm just going to put my big boy pants on and skip this tutorial. And what you might notice is that the process of creating an option set kind of looks like the process of creating a data type. So it's broken down into two separate sections. And the reason for that is because we essentially are creating a data type. Only instead of allowing our users to input that data, we as the admins are inputting that, and we're finalizing what it is right now. So for our option sets here, the first one was called the account type. So I'm going to call this the account type. I'll hit enter. And then on the right-hand side, this kind of looks like the same process of where you can create a data field. And that's because we essentially are. This is the data that's going to be pre-stored within this option set. And so right now, all I need to do is add in my two account type options. And look, for my tutorial today, I'm going to keep things pretty simple. I'm only going to have a bookkeeper, or I'm going to have an admin. Now, by all means, if you want to add more options here for different account types, feel free to pause this tutorial and add as many as you would like in here, but I'm going to keep that super basic. The other option set that I had here was the expense categories. And so if I jump over into Bubble, I'm going to create a new option set, and it's going to be called expense categories. Now, when it comes to option sets, you are allowed to use plurals, because at this point in time, we are creating all of those categories at once. We're not just creating one individual category. So that's my exclusion to the rule that I mentioned about my data types. Now I can see that I have a small typo there that I need to fix, but now what I'm going to do is add all of my categories in. So these were things like transport, marketing, payroll, and so on. So let's add these in. It's going to be transport, marketing, payroll, software, office, supplies, and other. Now, once again, if you'd like to add a bunch of different categories or more options, feel free to pause this tutorial and add those in now. But if you're happy with that, let's jump back into our Notion checklist and just tick off that we've finished adding all of those option sets in. And that's all we need to worry about for option sets. I know that was a little bit of a side quest from our main database, but trust me, it's all going to make sense when we build out our data fields right now. So for our data fields, let's scroll on up. And look, I feel like this is kind of the main event. Everything's been building into this. What we're going to do is build out all of the data fields for our user data type first. So let's jump into Bubble, open up our data types, and select our user here. What we're going to then do on the right-hand side is create a new field. And the first thing we'll need to do is give this a name. And for this field name, I am just going to call this name. So every single time a user registers an account, I'd like to store their name. Now, what you'll need to do when you create a data field is just reference what type of data you want to store for this. So if you scroll on down, you'll see we have the option to store this as text, a number, a date, a yes/no field, an image, or even an address. There's no shortage of options. But look, thankfully, for this data field, it's super straightforward. We're just going to select text because a name will be written. I'm going to choose to create this, and as you'll see, it will add that into our data field. Then we're going to create another field, and this is going to be called the profile photo. Now, one thing I should point out is the way I've spelt this. Instead of adding a space between these two words, I've added a dash. Now look, that was intentional. When it comes to my data fields, I personally like to split all of my words with a dash. Now this is just a personal preference of mine, but the reason I do this is because for my data types, I separate those words with spaces, and for my data fields, I separate these with dashes. So later on, when I need to reference data types or fields within my bubble editor, I can easily just know what belongs to what. But for this data field, we're going to scroll on down and we're going to set that this should be an image. And I'm going to choose to create that. And something I'm actually going to do for this data field is give this a default value. So that just means that every single time someone creates a user account, it's automatically going to have a profile photo stored for them. Now, why would I want to do that? Not everyone is automatically going to go to their settings page and upload a custom profile photo. In fact, some people might never do that. So instead of not being able to display an image, what I'm going to do is upload a kind of like profile avatar that's going to take its place. Kind of similar to my own bubble editor right now. So you can see I haven't uploaded the custom photo myself. So it's just got this little default avatar being displayed in the top right-hand corner. Now, when it comes to the image I'm going to upload, I've already taken care of this for you. I've got a Google Drive here with a bunch of different assets that we're going to use throughout our tutorial today. And of course, I'll be sure to include a link to this within the description of this video. So you can download all of these and you can follow along and use the exact same images that I am. But what I've got here is just a user profile photo. It looks super basic, but look, it's going to get the job done. So let's jump back into Bubble here. And under the default value for this data field, we're going to upload that image. And once that's uploaded, that's all we need to do for that field. We do need to create another field though, and this is going to be called the company. So for every user that signs up to our QuickBooks clone today, I want them to either be the owner or a team member of a company. And a company is a business. If you remember, we created a data type specifically for that. So for this field type here, what I'm gonna do, and this is where you're gonna see the power of Bubble come to life, I'm gonna link this to my business data type. And so what we've just done here in technical terms is we've created a relational database, which just means that all of our data types can communicate to each other. So they can send different information and store bits of different information under each data field. So essentially today, someone's going to be able to come to our app, register an account, and if they're the owner of a business, they can register their business. Then when they invite team members to their business, we can store that business as a company under each of those team members. So that way we can only show them access to the information that belongs to their company. So that's a super powerful feature inside of Bubble that most no-code tools just don't really have at this point in time. I'm then going to choose to create this field here, and we're almost there. The very last field I want to create is just known as the account type. And as you may have guessed here, this is going to be linked to my option set list. So that way a user can either be an admin or a bookkeeper. So what we're going to do is select the account type option and create that. And that is everything we need to add under our user data type. So let's jump back into Notion and check all of those fields off. And as you can see, we're finally starting to make some progress on our overall database. The next list of data fields is going to be under our business. So this is going to be very similar to the user data type. If we jump into Bubble here and open up our business data type, we're going to create our first field, and this is going to be the company name. So the company name is of course going to be the name of the business. It's super straightforward. This is just going to be a text field. Then we'll create another field known as the logo. And look, this is like the profile photo for a business. So this field type is going to be an image. I'll create that. And once again, I am just going to upload a default image. So within my Google Drive here, I created just a standard asset that you could use for a company logo. So if I jump back into Bubble, I'm going to upload that. And once that has loaded, we're going to create yet another field. And this is going to be called the website. So this will just be the URL. So that way, if we ever need to display that on an invoice, we have that information. Now for this field type, it's going to be super straightforward. It's just going to be text. We don't need to format that as anything special. I'll create this here. Then there was going to be our phone number for this business. And contrary to what you might think, I'm not going to store this data type as a number. Instead, I'm only going to store this as text. In Bubble, the only time you'd ever use a number is if you ever want to perform a calculation on something. But if you ever just want to display a number as text, it just needs to be text. It's super straightforward. Then for our next field, I'm going to call this the tax number. So that way we can display this on an invoice that a company creates. And once again, this field type is just going to be plain text because I just want to display a number. I don't need to perform a calculation on it. And then finally, the very last field is just going to be the address of the business. Because once again, if I want to add that to my invoice, I'd like to have that information handy. And look, this field type, if I scroll all the way down, is going to be a geographic address. And what that's going to mean is that we can link this to Google Maps later on. So that way we can pull and store our real world address. And you can even display it on a map if you would like. And they're going to choose to create that. And that's all of the data fields under my business data type. So what I'm then going to do is jump back into my Notion checklist, tick all of those data fields off, and then head to our customer data type. So if we open up Bubble and select our customer, the first thing I'd like to add is the contact name. So this is the name of the customer. And for this field type, once again, it's just going to be plain text. I'm then going to create a field known as the company name. So this is the name of the company that this customer works at. So let's say if John Smith worked at Google, the contact name would be John Smith and the company name would be Google. So I'm just going to scroll on down and set this as a text field. I'm then going to need to store some additional information about this customer. And the next piece of information is going to be their contact email. So I just need to be able to have an email address that I can send invoices to. And this field type is going to be a text field type. I'll create that. We'll build out another field. And this is going to be the contact number. So this would be John's phone number in this case. So for this field type, we'll set that as text because we don't need to perform a calculation on it. It's just going to display that number. I can create that there. And then the very last field I need to add is going to be called the original business, or I'm going to abbreviate this as OG business. And the purpose of this field here is that when a new customer is created inside of our database, I need to link that to a business. So in a real world example here, let's say I am a business owner and I have created my own QuickBooks account. And I've then invited you to my company as a bookkeeper. Within our company account, we should theoretically only see all of the customers that belong to us, not customers that belong to any other company. So what we need to do is create a data field which just segments which company or business each customer belongs to within our database. So for this field type here, I'm actually going to link this to our business data type. And so that way when a customer is created, we can link it to the same business as the person who created that. So I'm going to choose to create this here. And thankfully that's everything we need to build under this data type. So let's jump back into Notion, check those off, scroll on down, and now look at our expense data type. So if we jump into Bubble, open up our expense, not our expense item, the first thing I'm going to recognize is the payee. So this is the person that we've paid this expense to. And for this field type, it's just going to be text. I'll create that. Then I'm going to create another field and I'm going to call this the payment date. So this was obviously the date in which this expense was purchased. So I'm going to scroll on down and set this to be a date. It's pretty straightforward and I'm going to choose to create that. I'll then create another field and I'm going to call this the reference number. So this is kind of like the invoice number that I've received as the person who's paid that invoice. And for this field type, it's just going to be a text type. I'll create that there. Then I'll also need to recognize what the total cost was for this expense. Now for this field type, this is going to be a number because I'd like to be able to perform calculations on this price here. So I'm going to choose to create that. I'd also then like to be able to attach a photo of this receipt to this expense if I would like. So I'm going to create a field here and I'm going to call it the receipt. And for this field type, I'm going to set this to be an image. So that way we can upload an image from our camera roll. I'll create that there. I'll then build out another field and I'm going to call this the notes. So that way, if you ever want to add some internal notes to this expense to explain what it is or why you bought it, you can easily do that. Now, because we're going to be typing out text, this field type is just going to be text. And we're nearly there. There's just two last data fields I need to add. The first is going to be called items. And I'm actually going to link this to my expense item data type. And I'm going to tick this option here to make this a list with multiple entries. So what that means is that on one expense, I can have multiple expense items. And when I create this, later on, what we're going to do is we're going to get the cost of each of those expense items, and we're going to calculate that to equal the total cost of this overall expense. So it's quite cool what you can do when you actually link all of your data types together. And then finally, there's one last field I need to add, and that's going to be called the OG business. So once again, I want to be able to link this expense to one particular company so I know which data to display inside of which company account. So for this field type, it will once again be a business, and I will create that. Then we can jump back into Notion and tick all of these data fields off there. Now for the next data type, our expense item, I just need to be able to store some data about that specific item. And the first thing I need to store is the category. So we're going to create segments for these expense items. So that way later on in my dashboard, I can break all of my expenses down by their categories. So under my expense item data type here, I'm going to create a field and I'm just going to call this the category. And this field type will of course be linked to my expense categories, which was my option set list that I had pre-created. I'll choose to create that there. Then for each expense item, I'd also like to calculate the cost of it. So for this field type, it's going to be a number. And look, I can format that as a currency later on, but I'm just going to store that as a number. Then for our next field, this is going to be called the description. So that way, if you wanted, you could quickly make notes on what each item is. And for this field type, it's just going to be text there. And then of course, I'd also like to be able to link this expense item back to a specific business. So once again, I'm going to create a new field and that will be called the OG business. And this is where I'm going to link this to the original business that created this expense item. So once again, I'm going to link this to my business data type and I'll create that there. We can then jump back into Notion, highlight these fields and tick those off. And we're almost there. There's just 2 data types left to build out. And the next one is going to be our invoice, which has quite a few data fields in it. But of course, I'm going to walk you through each of these as we add these into our database. So over in Bubble, let's open up our invoice data type. And the very first field I'd like to create is going to be the invoice number. Now, this is just going to be a number we display in plain text. We're not going to perform calculations with it. So this means that it's going to be a text field. I'll create this here. Then for each invoice, I'd like to link this to a customer that it's sent to. So I need to create a field and I'm going to call this the customer field. And for this field type, I'm going to link this to my customer data type. I'm going to choose to create that. For every invoice, it should also have an invoiced date. So this was the date in which you're going to be sending this to your customer. And this field type is of course going to be a date. I'll create that, but then I'm going to create another date field, and this time it's going to be the due date. So this is when the invoice should be paid by. And for this field type, once again, it's going to be a date. I'll create that there. But just when you thought we were done with dates, I've got one more for you, and that's going to be the paid date. So this is the date in which the customer successfully makes the payment for this invoice. So for this field type, once again, it will be a date. And another field I'd like to create is going to be the status of this invoice. So I want to recognize, has this invoice been paid or is it currently pending? So what I'm going to do is create a field here and I'm going to call this the paid status. And for this field type, we're going to set this to be a yes/no type. So it either is going to be paid or it's not going to be paid. And when I create this, what I'm also going to do is give this a default value. So by default, I want this to be set to no, because when an invoice is created, it should not be paid at that point in time. It of course will only be updated once the customer makes a successful payment. Now within each invoice, I'd also like to add a series of invoice items, which is our separate data type. So similar to our expense and our expense items, an overall invoice can have multiple invoice items. So I'm going to call this field items, and I'm going to link this to my invoice item data type, and I'm going to tick that should be a list of multiple entries, because of course we can have more than one item on each invoice. We'll also create a field known as the total price. So later on, we're going to calculate the total sum of all of those invoice items, and then we're going to figure out the total price. Now, because this is going to be a number that we can perform a calculation on, I need to store this as a number in my database. Then for the last few fields, I'm just going to create one known as the PDF. So whenever we generate an invoice, I'd like to create a PDF version of that and send it to a customer in an email. So what I need to do is of course be able to generate and store that PDF on this invoice. So for this field type, it's going to actually be a file. And look, I've got a dedicated module that explains how we can capture a PDF of a page and store that as a file. But for now, this is all we need to create. So we're going to add that in there. And then finally, we're going to link this invoice back to a business that it belongs to. So I'm going to create a field and I'm going to call this the OG business once again. And this, of course, will be linked to our business data type. Then if we jump back into Notion, we can tick off that we've finished adding all of those data fields in. And the very last series of data fields is just going to be under our invoice item. So these are each of the line items that are going to be added to an overall invoice. So if we jump into Bubble, let's open up our invoice item. And the very first field is going to be known as the title. So this is the name of that invoice item. I'm going to set this as a text field. We'll create that. We're going to add another field, and this one's going to be called the description. So this is going to allow you to add some additional information to explain to your customer what that service was or what the product was in more detail. So for this field type, once again, it will be a text type. Then I'm going to determine what the rate was for this particular item. So this will be the total cost of that item. And if I scroll on down, I'm going to set this to be a number because I will need to perform a calculation using this particular data later on. So I'm going to create that. I'm then going to create a field known as the quantity. So if, let's say, you're invoicing for some services where you bill by an hour, what you need to determine is how many hours you want to bill for. Or if someone purchased multiple items, this is going to be how many items they bought from you. So for this field type, this is also going to be a number because I'd like to use this when I'm performing calculations later on. Then for each invoice item, because I'm calculating the rate and the quantity, I'd like to know the total cost of each item. And for this field type, once again, this is also going to be a number. And then finally, the very last field we need to add is a link back to the business that created this invoice item. So I'm going to add a field known as the OG business. And of course, this field type is going to be linked to the business there. And after adding that field in, we can jump into Notion, check all of those off. And look, that is absolutely everything we had to build out when it comes to creating our own custom database. There is just one little thing I should highlight though, is that over in our database here, under our data types, you may have noticed that your user data type has this text here, which just says there's a privacy rule applied to it. And so if I click this here, what this just essentially means is that by default, Bubble's out of the privacy rule where users can only see the information that they create inside of your app. Now, while that might be great for some certain use cases, for our tutorial today, we don't want this. What this essentially means is that if, let's say, you and I were a part of the same company, and if I was to create some expenses or some invoices, I would be the only person who could view that information, not you, even though you are a member of my team. So that's why this privacy rule should not apply to our app today. So what I'm going to do is select this trash can icon and delete that there. And now you'll see that this data type will be publicly visible, which is exactly what we want. And look, that is the very last thing that we need to cover when it comes to our database. I know I rambled on for quite some time, but it is so important to know how you can actually structure a database because as I mentioned at the start of this module, this is going to be used to power your entire QuickBooks clone today. Once we've finished taking the time to set up and configure our own custom database, we can move on down to the list of all the features we're going to build out throughout our tutorial today. Now look, this is quite an extensive list. I truly wanted to leave no stone unturned. And of course, I'm going to make sure I cover everything you need to know in as much detail as possible. However, we're going to start nice and simple at the beginning of our tutorial. So right at the top here, we're just going to take the time to redesign essentially the home page of QuickBooks. Now, this isn't going to be the home page of the actual application itself. Instead, it's going to be the marketing home page. And so what do I mean by that? If I was to jump over to the real world QuickBooks website, what you'll see is that on the home page here, we actually don't have an accounting dashboard. The home page itself is just a marketing page. So it tells you all about the product. So you can see at the top of this page, we've got kind of like this navigation menu, which if you were to click through to any of these drop downs, it would just tell you about the features of the product. We then have this hero section with an image, some text, and some call to action buttons. And then if you were to scroll down the page, it includes a bunch of additional information about the product. So on this page, this isn't the actual QuickBooks product that your users are going to interact with. Instead, what they're going to do is at the top of this page, they're going to be able to actually log in or create an account. And once they do that, that's going to take them through to a separate page, which is going to be the actual application itself. So that's the application you see inside of this little screenshot here. But for the sake of keeping things consistent, what I'd like to do today is just explain to you first how we can build this marketing page. Now, I'm going to build a shortened version of this. I'm not going to walk you through how to create every single section of this because it would take a whole day to just explain that. And look, my main priority today is to actually teach you how to build the application of QuickBooks itself. But I think it'd be rude if I didn't cover how to build the marketing page first. So all I'm going to build within my tutorial today for this section is just this little navigation menu you see at the top and our hero section here. Then I'm going to leave it to your interpretation to include whatever else you'd like to add onto this page. So what we're going to do first is jump over into our bubble editor here. Now inside of our bubble editor, you'll notice that by default you have this empty page here, and this is known as your index page. So if we were to head to the page drop-down menu, you can see we have this index page. Now the index page is essentially just your home page. So this is the page that's going to load every single time someone comes to your application. And in this case, it's going to be our marketing page. So whenever someone visits our website or our web app, they're going to come to this page first, which is perfect because if a user does not have an account, it'll prompt them to create one. And if a user does have an account, they can easily just log into that. Now, when it comes to the process of actually designing this homepage, this is where I'm going to give you a small masterclass into responsive design inside of Bubble. So today what I want to do is create a beautiful experience for every user, regardless of what device size they're on. So whether that be desktop or mobile. And so throughout this section of our course, I'm going to cover a lot of key concepts that are just going to help you learn how to design applications inside of Bubble. Now, the very first thing you'll need to do whenever you have any blank page inside of Bubble is just double click on this page, and this is going to open up your property editor. So inside of Bubble, if you ever want to make changes to anything on your page, you'll do that within this little menu here. And you can drag this around the page wherever you would like. Now, the first thing we need to do on this index page is actually open up our layout tab here because we need to give this page a container layout. Now, if you're brand new to Bubble, you'll probably have no idea what a container layout is, and that is completely okay. A container layout essentially just determines in which order elements will be positioned on your page. And look, I understand that what I just said was probably even more gibberish, so I'm going to break it down for you with a real world example. So let's say I want to add 2 buttons onto my page. I'm just going to drag 2 of these onto my page anywhere. Right now, you'll see we have the option to actually just drag these buttons wherever we would like. Now, while that's going to make the experience of building our app nice and easy, unfortunately, it's not going to create a fully responsive experience. In order to do that, what we need to do is double click on our page, open up our layout tab, and update the container layout. Now, when you open up this drop-down menu, you're going to see 4 options. Now don't stress because I'll only ever choose one of 2 options from this drop-down menu here, and that is the row or the column option. So what on earth is the difference between these 2? If you were to select the row option, Bubble would position all of the elements on your page horizontally across the page. So everything would be positioned side by side. So watch what happens here when I click this row. As you can see, both of my buttons are automatically stacked side by side across my page. And then when it comes to the other option, which is the column, this is going to do the opposite. So it's going to stack elements vertically down your page, so on top of each other. And what you'll now see is that if I was to drag these elements and try and position them anywhere else on my page, they're automatically just going to be positioned vertically on top of each other. Now, while that gives you less freedom in terms of being able to drag elements wherever you would like, this is how you can create a truly responsive experience inside of Bubble. By using the existing frameworks that Bubble gives you here, it's going to take care of most of the heavy lifting when it comes to the responsive design. So that's why I'd always recommend to choose one of these 2 options here, the row or the column. And look, when it comes to the overall page container layout, I will in every single use case or scenario select the column option. Because when you think of most modern web applications or websites, these pages are built from the top down. So if I jump over to QuickBooks here, what you'll see is that at the top of our page, we have this navigation menu. And look, I get it. All of these elements are positioned horizontally across our page. But the actual navigation menu, when you think about it, sits directly on top of our hero section here. So this section is stacked on top of this section here. And if we scroll on down, our hero section is stacked on top of our review section here. So all of the elements are stacked from the top down. So please, 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 when you're actually selecting the container layout for the overall page, always choose the column option. Now, of course, later on, I'm still going to show you how we can stack elements horizontally across our page, even when we've selected the column option. But for now, we're just going to leave that as is. Now, the very first thing I'd like to build out on this page is going to be this navigation menu at the top here. And for our tutorial today, I'm going to build a bit of a simplified version of this. So as I mentioned just before, all of the elements at the top here are stacked horizontally. So in order to create an experience like this, what we need to do is first of all, delete my buttons that I've added onto the page. And we need to add what's known as a group element onto the page. So if I scroll on down to my containers menu, I'm going to grab a group element and add this onto my page. Now, if you're brand new to Bubble, you probably have no idea what a group is. And the best way to explain what a group is that it's like a small page that sits inside of your overall page. Now, why would you want to add a small page onto your existing page? The reason for that is because, like our overall page, a group has the ability to give it a container layout. So on our page here, if I want to stack elements horizontally across our page, so side by side, what I could do is add this small little page into my overall page, and I could set its container layout to be a row. Now that means that any elements I add inside of this group or this mini page are going to be stacked side by side. So that's how we can create the exact experience we're looking for today. Now, groups also do have a bunch of different benefits, like being able to store and send data into them, which I'm going to explain later on throughout our tutorial today. But at this point in time, we don't need to touch base on that. But I should just highlight how important groups are inside a Bubble. If you're watching any other tutorials, whether it be mine or someone else's, you'll notice that when it comes to actually building an app in Bubble, it's truly just a matter of stacking groups on top of each other, kind of like they're Lego blocks. Groups are the building blocks for any application. So throughout our tutorial today, we're going to be very familiar with groups by the end of our build. Now, the first thing I'm going to do for this group here is actually give this a name. So if I head over to my property editor, I'm just going to select on the name here, and I'm going to update this to be called Group Menu Header. Then I'm going to jump over to my Appearance tab and quickly just update the way this group appears on my page. So right now, if I was to click away, you can't actually see this group on the page. So it's kind of hard to interpret where it sits while I'm building out my app. So what I'm going to do is select on the group, head on down to my styling here and just attach the default style. And I'm just going to give this a solid border. So that way when I click away, I can actually see where my group lies on the page. I'm also then going to select on my group and have it expand across the full width of my page. And this is where we're going to start to dabble in the process of creating fully responsive apps. So if I open up my layout tab, so by now, if you haven't figured out, the layout tab is where you can determine the shape, the size, and the responsive settings for any element inside of your app. And if you scroll on down here, you're going to see the option which is known as the width. And this is where we can start to make our application fully responsive. So right now, this group is fixed at 280 pixels. And so what do I mean by it's fixed? The term fixed just means that this group will always be 280 pixels, regardless of the size of my page. So this right here is 280 pixels, and this group will always be that exact same size. So if I was to scroll it up on my left menu and open up my responsive tab, I'm just going to close my property editor and reduce the width of my page. So as we start to view this on a mobile device, as you can see here, this group doesn't change size. And in fact, if we reduce our page so small, this group is not responsive because it's not adapting to the width of our page. So what we need to do is change that. So if I open up my UI builder and double click on my group once again, what we're going to do is unselect that this group should be a fixed width. And this is where I really need you to pay attention because what I'm about to show you is a core concept that I'm going to use a million times throughout our tutorial today. And that is how we can create a fully responsive experience, regardless of whatever device a user is viewing our app on. So once you unselect that this group should be a fixed width, you'll see the option to have two fields here. There's the minimum width and the maximum width. When it comes to creating a truly responsive experience, what we're going to do is set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. And what that essentially means is that regardless of the page size, this group can shrink down to the minimum width of 0 pixels. So that is the smallest possible size. And when the page expands out, the maximum width is infinite. So this group is just going to continually take up as much width as it can. So if we jump back over to our responsive tab, close my property editor, as I expand the width of my page out, as you'll see, because the group has an infinite maximum width, it will also expand out with my page. And if I shrink my page down, this group will just shrink right down to 0 pixels. So that is how we've created a truly responsive experience. And you're going to hear me use this exact same setting a million different times throughout my tutorial today, but I just need you to know that. Now look, we are going to come back and update our height settings in a moment, but we need to add all of our elements inside of this group before we do that. Because if I was to set my minimum height to be 0, it would just collapse down and we can't actually see anything inside of that. So we just need to add all of our text and our buttons in this before we change that setting. So I'm just going to revert that change there. And when it comes to all of the elements inside of this group, the first thing I'm going to do is add a Quickbooks logo, just like the real world product. So I'm going to head over to my visual elements. I'm going to grab an image and add this into my group. Now I've already taken the time to download a Quickbooks logo. And if you'd like to use the exact same image that I'm about to use, I've taken the time to upload this into a Google Drive here. So these are all of the assets that I'm going to use today. And of course, I'll be sure to include a link in the description of this video so you can download these and follow along with me. But right now I'm just going to use this Quickbooks logo that has the black text. So if I head over to my bubble editor, I'm just going to upload a static image. And once this image has uploaded, as you can see right now, it's kind of skewed. The dimensions aren't really correct. So what we need to do is change those within our layout tab. So when it comes to the dimensions of this image, I'm just gonna set the width here to be 250 pixels. Now look, I am gonna leave this as a fixed width because I don't want this image to stretch out or shrink based on the size of our page. I'll only ever want it to be this exact width here, no larger and no smaller. So that's why I'm going to keep this as a fixed width. Now I'm also going to tick this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed. And by default, it's going to get the aspect ratio of the image itself. So right now, as you can see, the formatting is much better. I'm also just going to vertically align this image in the center of my group. And then I'm just going to add in 20 pixels of margin around every single border. So that way later on, when I reduce the size of this group it sits within, it won't touch the borders of the image itself. Then after adding this image into our group, we can go ahead and build out the rest of our menu here. So I'm just going to add in a couple of different text options as well as some buttons. And look, if it helps, I actually have an example of what we're going to build right here. So as I mentioned, today we're going to be building a simplified version of this homepage. But the reason I wanted to show you this is because I just wanted to highlight how we're going to build the rest of our menu here. So what you can see is on the right hand side of my overall group, we've got another group. And I've highlighted this in red so you can easily see what this looks like. And inside of that red group, we've got 2 text options as well as 2 buttons. So a user can either register or log into their Quickbooks account. Now the reason why I've added all of these elements inside of another group is because when it comes to our menu here, I wanted to split this into 2 different halves. And I want just the logo to be on the left-hand side here, and I want everything else to be pushed to the right-hand side. And so because I want all of these 4 elements to be positioned together, I've added these into their own group. And so if you remember before how I mentioned that when it comes to building inside a bubble, you're going to be stacking a bunch of different groups on top of each other. This is exactly what I meant. So what we're going to do is jump back to our main bubble editor here, and we're going to add another group inside of our existing group here. So if I scroll on down to my containers, I'm going to grab a group, I'll add this in, and the very first thing I'd like to do for this group is actually not update the container layout, but instead jump to my appearance tab and detach the default style of this. Now this is just a personal preference of mine, but if you're new to Bubble, I think you'll be interested in this. So for this group, what I'm going to do is give this a background style, and I'm going to make this a light shade of red. Now the reason for this is because when I'm building in Bubble, I want to be able to see where all of my different groups lie on my page. Because if I was to just leave this as white, and if I was to click away, you wouldn't even know there's a group there. So that's why I like to actually color code all of my groups while I'm building my application. Now, of course, when you go to preview or publish your app, you can remove that color. But for the time being, I'd recommend just color coding everything because it kind of makes you feel like you're building with Lego blocks, which in my opinion makes the whole process much more enjoyable. So right now we can see where this group sits within my overall navigation menu. And from here, what we can do is jump over to our layout tab and of course, update the container layout of this group as well. Now inside of this group, we're going to be stacking a bunch of different elements side by side or horizontally across my page. So that means we're going to need to set the container layout to be a row. And for the time being, I'm also just going to make this group fully responsive because right now it's set at a fixed width of 280 pixels. So we don't really have much room to add all of the elements I want inside of this. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. For the time being, I'll set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. And what that means is that this group can take up as little or as much space as it can inside of my existing group. So right now it's sharing all of this space with the logo here, and then it's taking up whatever additional space it has. Then from here, inside of this red group, what we're gonna do is add a couple of different text elements and 2 buttons. So if we scroll on up to our visual elements, I'm gonna grab a text element, I'll add this into my red group, and this is just going to display the words learn and support. And when it comes to this text, I'm gonna scroll on down to my styling. I'm gonna detach the default style because I'd like to update the font size to be 18, and I'm gonna choose to bold this, so that way it really stands out on my page. I'll then also jump over to my layout tab and make this text element somewhat responsive. So right now, as you can see around this text, we've got all of this empty space. So what I'd like to do is remove that. So if I head over to my width setting here, at this point in time, I can see that this element has a fixed width of 200 pixels. So what I'm gonna do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm gonna set the minimum width to be 0, but I also don't want the maximum width to be infinite because as you can see, it's taking up all of the empty space inside of my red group. So what I'm gonna do is something different, which is tick this option here, which will fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And that just means it's going to keep it tightly wrapped around all of the text here. And then I'm gonna do the exact same thing for the height. So right now I can see that there's a minimum height of 45 pixels. So that's just telling Bubble that there needs to be at least 45 pixels of height for this whole element. Whereas what I'd like to do is if I set this to be 0, it's automatically going to wrap around all of the text there. So now everything is tightly knit together. I'm then going to vertically align this in the center of my red group, which just means that it will always be positioned in the center. And it's also, of course, going to line up with my Quickbooks logo. And that is all I'll need to change for this text element. What I'm then gonna do is make a copy of this. So on my Mac, I'm gonna hit Command C. I'm gonna select in my red group and hit Command V. And that's, of course, just going to make a copy of this text. And for this text here, I'm just gonna jump over to my Appearance tab and update this to display the word pricing. Now, because we've copied this text across, it's going to copy with it all of the styling as well as the layout settings that we've already updated. So we don't need to do all of that again. The only thing I'd just like to change is the margin between both of these elements here. So I just wanna add some space to the left of our second text element. So I'm just gonna add 20 pixels of margin on the left there. And we're almost there when it comes to building out all of the elements inside of this group. The next thing I'd like to add is going to be a button, which is going to prompt someone to register an account. So I'm gonna head over to my visual elements and grab a button, and I'll add this into my red group here. And when it comes to this button, the first thing I'll do is just update the text that's displayed inside of it. So I'm gonna have this display the word register. I'm then gonna head on down to my styling here, and instead of detaching the style, what I'm gonna do is actually build on top of one of the existing styles. And if you're not familiar with styles inside of Bubble, I'm happy to give you a quick little masterclass right now. So a style is just a way of creating a consistent design pattern that you can use across any page or place inside of your app. So let's say I have a button here and I don't want it to be blue. And look, as you can see, by default, the color of the button is blue. Let's say I wanted this button to be green like the Quickbooks logo. Theoretically, every single time I add a button into my app, what I could do is detach the default style, I could manually update the color and make this a shade of green. But look, the problem with that is that I'm gonna have to manually go through this process every single time I want that exact color. And so this is the benefit of a design style. With a design style, what you can do is actually make that change once and save it as a style. Then every single time you add a button onto your page, you can reference that style and it will automatically take on the settings that you've edited. Now look, I don't use styles for every single element I add into Bubble. I only use it for elements where I know that I'm gonna reference that particular style multiple times throughout my app. And with my button today, I am gonna create a style that we're gonna use other places. So it makes perfect sense to create a style right now. And instead of using the primary button style, what I'm gonna do is use the outline button style. Because if I jump over to my separate Bubble editor here, as you can see, my two buttons here have an outline. They're white on the inside, but they just have a black border and some black text. So we're gonna replicate that exact same design style right now. So once we've selected the outline button, instead of detaching the style and making a couple of minor tweaks here, what we're going to do is edit the actual style itself. And it's going to take us through to our styles tab. And right now you can see a list of all of the elements that have design styles. But in this instance, we're just going to update the style for our outline button. And this, of course, is a preview of what this style is going to look like. Now for this button, we only need to make a few minor tweaks. The first thing I'm going to do is just update the color of the text inside of it. And if you'd like this color code, it's 434343. I'm then going to update the border color. So similar to before, I'm going to update this to be the same black color code, which is 434343. And that is all we need to change for now. So if we jump back to our design tab, what you'll now see is that when I click away, this button has automatically taken on that design style. And that's because I'm referencing the outline button style within our attribute dropdown here. So that's all we need to change there. The only other thing I'd like to do for this button is, of course, jump over to my layout tab. Just align this vertically in the center of my red group. While we're here, I'm also going to update the width of this button. Instead of it being 150 pixels, I'm going to set this as 120. Now I'm going to keep this as a fixed width because I don't want this button to expand out or contract based on the size of our page. I'm only ever going to want it to be this exact width at any point in time, which is why I've selected this to be 120 pixels as a fixed value. Then finally, while we're in our layout tab, I'm just going to add 20 pixels of margin on the left. So that way there's some space between our button and this text element. And then from here, we're going to make a copy of this button. And the only thing we'll need to change here is within our appearance tab. I'm just going to have this display the word login. Now that is all of the elements that we need to add inside of our second group here. So our red group. So what I can now do is select on my red group and close off all of this empty space around these elements. Because right now it's not really looking exactly how we'd like it. So if I jump over to my layout tab here, so this is for my red group, what I'm going to do is update the minimum height first of all. So right now by default, whenever you add a group onto your page, the minimum height will be 280 pixels. So if I set this to be 0 pixels, this means that the minimum height will collapse around all of the elements inside of it. And so right now you can see it's touching the borders of my buttons. I'm also going to do the exact same thing for the width here because I've got all of this empty width that I don't need to use. So when it comes to the width of this group, I'm going to tick this option to fit the width of this element to the content inside of it. And that's going to collapse this horizontally around all of my elements that sit inside of it. And so right now you can see we've created this perfect little section here, which is almost like a subgroup within our overall group. And now for this group, what I'd also like to do is vertically align this in the center of our main group. So once again, it's in line with our Quickbooks logo. And then finally, while we're here, I'm just going to scroll down to my margins and add 20 pixels of margin at the top, the bottom, none on the left, but 20 pixels of margin on the right. And what that's going to do is when we collapse all of the empty space in our main group, it's just going to ensure that this group doesn't directly touch the red group inside of it. But look, before we do that, we need to make one last change. Right now, you can see that all of these elements are currently sitting side by side together towards the left of my page. Whereas when it comes to the experience I want to create today, I want my Quickbooks logo to be on the left, but I want this red group to be on the right. So how can I change that? If I double click on my main group here, so this is the group that I gave a name to. So my group menu header. What I could do is scroll on up to near my container layout. And when you've selected the row option as your container layout, you'll see the ability to update your container alignment horizontally. So your container alignment just determines in which order all of the elements will sit inside of this group. Now, another thing I should quickly just touch base on is the word container. A container is kind of like another word for a group. So inside of a group, you can kind of think of that group like a lunchbox in a way. So it's like a container. And inside of that container, you're storing everything that you want. So that's what bubble just means by this being a container. Now at this point in time, the container alignment is set to the left, which is why all of my elements are being pushed to the side. If I wanted to position these in the center, as you'll see, these will evenly be distributed in the center of my group. But today I'm interested in using this option here known as the space between. And what this is going to do is add an even amount of space between both of these elements inside of this group. And it's going to push them to each side of my page. So that's how we can create the exact experience we're looking for. Now, finally, the very last thing we'll need to do is just update the minimum height of our overall group here. So if I set this to be 0, by default, we have this option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, which just means that it's going to wrap around all of the elements we've added into this group. Now look, I know it took so damn long to build out just a small navigation menu, but throughout this process, I wanted to try and explain as much as I could about creating responsive apps inside of Bubble. But right now from here, what I'd like to do is just build out one last section on this page, and that's going to be the hero section where we display some text as well as an image. Now, when it comes to this section here, when I look at this, what I see is two different elements sitting side by side. So what I've actually done within this existing editor is I've added another group onto my page, which is this navy color that you see here. And I've set its container layout to be a row, so I could stack two elements side by side. One element is an image, and the other element is this gray group that you see here, because inside of that group, I'm stacking two additional elements. So there's our text and then there's a button, and those are stacked vertically, not horizontally. But don't worry, I'll explain all that as we add this onto our page. But the thing I just wanted to highlight is how we're stacking two different elements side by side once again. So we need to add this overall group onto our page first. So if I jump back to our main Bubble editor, we're going to scroll on down to our containers menu and grab yet another group here. I'm going to add this onto my page, and the first thing I'll do for this group is update the background color so we can see where it sits on our page. So what we're going to do is select on our appearance tab here, scroll on down to our styling and detach the default style. Now in this instance, we're going to create a one-off style because we don't need to reference this color at any different point throughout our app. So we don't need to create that custom style. But when it comes to this group, I'm going to set the background style to be a flat color. And if you'd like this color code, it's 0D333F. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab. And as I mentioned just before, I'm going to set the container layout here to be a row because once again, I'd like to stack elements horizontally within this. For the time being, I'm also going to make this fully responsive. So if I unselect that this should be a fixed width, I'm going to set my minimum width to be 0 and leave my maximum width as infinite, which of course means that this group can take up as little or as much space as it needs on my overall page. And then inside of this group, we can add both of our elements. So the first thing I'd like to do is add an image element. So I'm going to add this into my group here, and I'm going to upload a static image. Now we're just going to be using the image within my Google Drive, which is known as the marketing page image. So if you wanted to take the time to download that now and then upload this as a static image, it's going to be exactly what you need. And once I've added this image in, before I update any of the layout settings, I'm just going to add a group element into this. And for this group, I'm just going to detach the default style for now, give it a flat background color, and I could make this whatever color I want. So I'm just going to make this a light shade of gray. And the purpose of this is to just make sure I can see where it sits on my page. Of course, when you go to preview or publish your app, you can remove that color. But for the sake of our tutorial today, it's just going to make it easier to interpret where everything sits on my page. Now from here, the first thing I'd like to do is actually build out the image. So if I double click on my image and jump over to my layout tab, I'm going to move this to the next position in my page, which is just going to switch the order of these two elements. So it's now moved it to the right-hand side. Within my layout tab, I'm then going to vertically align this image in the center of my group, just to make sure it's going to sit perfectly in line there. And then for the width of this image, I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite for now. And so what this means, of course, is that this image is now going to be fully responsive. So it's either going to stretch out and fit the width of our page or shrink down if someone's viewing this on a smaller device. So I don't want this image to always be the same size. I want it to be fully responsive. I'm also then going to tick this option to keep this image's aspect ratio fixed, and I'll leave it as the default ratio here. And then finally, I'm just going to add 20 pixels of margin on the left and 20 pixels of margin on the right. And that's just going to ensure that the borders of this image won't touch the borders of my page, as well as the group I've added beside it. Now that's everything we need to change for our image here. But what I'd now like to do is build everything out that's going to sit inside of our gray group. And if I was to jump back to my previous Bubble editor, as you can see inside of this group, we have two elements. There's this text element and there's this button. And these are stacked vertically on top of each other. So when it comes to this group here, what I'll need to do is first of all, double click on this, head to my layout tab and set the container layout to be a column, not a row, because I'm stacking elements vertically. I'm then going to unselect that this should be a fixed width, and I'm going to set the minimum width as 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So once again, this group is also going to be fully responsive. So as the page expands, this group will expand out, and as the page shrinks, it will also shrink down. Now, before I update any of the height or the margins, I'm going to add both of my elements inside of this group. And the very first element is, of course, going to be a text element. So I'm going to grab a text element under my visual elements. I'll add this into my group. And when it comes to this text, I'm just going to copy the exact text that QuickBooks uses on their homepage. And that is save time with seriously simple accounting software. And I can just see I have a small typo there that I need to fix. And for this text, I'm just going to scroll on down, detach the default style, and I'm going to set the font size here to be 48. So it's going to be quite large. I'll set the color as white, and I'm also going to choose to bold this. I'll then need to jump over to my layout tab and make this text fully responsive inside of my gray group. So in order to do that, of course, what I'm going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So right now this text will take up as little or as much space as it can on my page. And then I'll do the exact same thing for my height here. So I'm going to set the minimum height as 0. And what that's just going to do is just ensure that it collapses around all of the text inside of it there. And then from here, the very last element that I need to add in is just going to be a button. So I'm going to add this below my text here. And this button's just going to display the word register. Now, when it comes to the style of this button here, I am just going to detach the default style because I'm going to create a one-off style that I'm not really going to use anywhere else throughout my app. So I don't need to worry about creating a custom style, although we will do that later on for another green button. So I'm just going to detach the style here. I'm going to scroll on down. For the text color of this button, what I'm going to do is make this the same shade of navy that we've used for the background of this group. So that color code is 0D333F. And then when it comes to the actual color of the button, what I'm going to do is set this to be a shade of green. And if I just add this in here, that color code is 2CA01C. And just another thing I'll need to do is open up this conditional tab because right now by default, every button has a condition, which I'll explain what those are later on throughout our tutorial today, where essentially when you hover over the button with your mouse, it just changes the color to be blue. And look, I don't really want that. So what I'm going to do is just remove this condition there. Then I can jump over to my layout tab. And when it comes to the width and the height of this button, I'm happy to leave this as the default settings. The only thing I just want to do is add 30 pixels of margin at the top. So that way this button has some space below our text element. Now that is all of the elements that I need to add inside of my gray group. So I'm just going to double click on my gray group, open up my layout tab, head down to my minimum height, and now set this to equals 0. And what that's going to do is just ensure that it will collapse around both of those elements that sit inside of it. Then while we're in our layout tab, I'm also going to vertically align this in the center of my overall page. So that way it sits in line with my image beside it. But for this group, I'm just going to add some additional margin around it. I'm going to add 50 pixels of margin at the top, 50 pixels of margin on the bottom, then 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And that's just going to ensure that this group won't touch the borders of my existing navy group, regardless of the page size. And at this point, if I was to close my property editor, that is essentially everything that I'd like to add onto my homepage for the time being. Now, as I mentioned at the start of this module, I only wanted to take the time to design a small section of the overall QuickBooks homepage. If I had to walk through how to create every single section on this page, as I mentioned before, I'd be here all day. And look, I'm going to leave it up to your interpretation to add whatever you want to include on your own marketing page. Instead, what I'd like to do today is focus all of our precious time on building out the actual software application of QuickBooks, not just the marketing side. Now, before we wrap up this module, there is one very last thing I need to cover, and that is how we can make a few minor tweaks to the responsive setting of this page. So if I was to open up my responsive tab, what you'll see is that when we're viewing this on a desktop device, it looks great. My image and my group are fully responsive. So as the page expands, so do they. And as the page shrinks, they also start to shrink. But where we're going to face a problem is when the page starts to shrink a little too small. As you can see at this particular width here, so on a mobile device, my text and my image are fighting for space, so they're becoming quite squished. So what we actually need to do is create some sort of way for these two elements to stack on top of each other. And so how can we do that? If I was to double click on both my group and then my image, and open up our layout tab, you might remember that I'd set the minimum width to be 0 and the maximum width as infinite. So that meant that each of these elements could take up as little or as much space as they could on my page. Now, because this has a minimum width of 0, it will go down to literally 0 pixels, whereas that's not really the experience that I want to create, as you've just seen. And so if I was to give this element a minimum width, it would just tell it that at a certain point in size, you are not allowed to get any smaller, which means that instead of shrinking down further, it would kind of just be stubborn and tell my page, hey, look, I need to take up this much space. If there's another element beside me, it needs to move down because I'm not moving at all. But how can we determine exactly what that minimum width should be? Thankfully, Bubble makes it super straightforward to find this out. If we're designing for the smallest possible mobile device, that's going to be 320 pixels. So exactly what you see here. Now look, most modern mobile devices sit around about the 380 to 420 pixel mark. So that's things like an iPhone 14, 15, any recent Samsung Galaxy devices. But what we need to cater for is the odd user who still lives in the Stone Age and is currently using an iPhone 5, because that itself is 320 pixels. So if this is the smallest possible size that we need to build for, in reality, our minimum width should be 320 pixels. But unfortunately, it's not that simple. So if we were to set the minimum width of this group to be 320 pixels, one thing we need to factor in is that this group also has 20 pixels of margin on each side. So if we want this whole section here to be 320 pixels, I need to get 320 minus 20 minus another 20, and that'll be the size that I want this group to be that sits inside of it. So 320 minus 40 is 280. So I'm going to set the minimum width to be 280. And they're going to do the exact same thing for my image beside this. So if I open up my layout tab, I'm going to set the minimum width to be 280. And then finally, I'm going to do the exact same thing for my red group at the top here. So if I open up my layout tab, I'm going to set its minimum width to be 280. So if I now jump over to my responsive tab, what you'll see is that when it comes to our hero section here, as we reduce the width of our page at around about 640 pixels, so that's 320 plus 320, these two elements are going to stack on top of each other. And this is going to create that truly responsive experience that we need. But look, from here, if we were to just run a preview of this page, this is what it's going to look like inside of your actual browser. And of course, at this point in time, we haven't yet built out any of the functionality for these buttons, but this is how we can build the crux of our overall marketing page. So what we're going to do is just jump back into my Notion checklist, and we can tick off that we finished building out the very first feature within our tutorial today, which was of course designing the home page, which is just the static marketing page. As we work our way through the checklist of items that I've set out for us today, what I actually want to do for the sake of our tutorial is just jump ahead, because what I want to do is focus on building out the main dashboard, so the core of our QuickBooks application. Now, this is going to be super exciting because this is going to be the most frequently used page inside of your app today. And what I'm actually going to do is break this down into a series of different modules, so that way we can approach it in a more bite-sized way. But what we're going to do first is just jump over into our Bubble editor. And over in our editor, at this point in time, I've gone ahead and I've created a dashboard page. So if you remember, our index page is going to be like the marketing page where users can learn about our product and eventually go on to register and log into their existing account. But when it comes to the actual software application known as QuickBooks, we're going to build this out on a separate page. So if I open up my page drop-down menu, I've created a page known as the dashboard page. Now, if you haven't done this, you'll just need to create a new page inside of Bubble and call this the dashboard. But up to this point, I haven't made any other changes to this page. And this is where we can start building. Now, in a separate tab here, I've just gone and created a brand new QuickBooks account. And this page right here is an example of exactly what we're going to be modeling our own product on. So the first thing I notice on this page is that it's broken down into two separate sections. On the left-hand side, we have this menu here. So we've got things like the QuickBooks logo, all of the core features, and if you hit this button, it opens up this drop-down menu. And on the right-hand side, we've got our main area. So this is where if you were to open up a feature, it would display all of the information you need within this section. Now look, today, my QuickBooks clone is going to be nowhere near as built out as the real-world product. Honestly, if you were to look at the feature list for QuickBooks, it's insane how much it covers. But for today, my main priority is building out a way to create and send invoices, create and track expenses, and of course build out a custom CRM as well as a dashboard so you can view all of that information within your own QuickBooks account. But as we build out all of those features, they're going to be displayed on this one page here, so our dashboard page. And so why don't we jump over into our Bubble editor and start building this out. Now look, in Bubble, there's so many different ways you could build this page out, but today I'm just going to show you my preference. So if I was to first of all double click on my page, the first thing I'll need to do is give this a container layout. Now I know what you're probably thinking. On the real world QuickBooks product, the page was broken into two separate sections that were positioned horizontally next to each other. So on the left, you've got this little menu here, and on the right, you've got the main content area. So you wouldn't be wrong in thinking that we'd need to set the container layout of our page to be a row, because we are positioning elements horizontally across our page. But look, for today, what I'm actually going to do is use the column option. So I am still technically going to stack all of my elements from top to bottom. And the reason I'm doing that is because later on within my tutorial, if someone's viewing this page on a mobile device, I'm actually going to want to hide this menu on the left here. And when this menu on the left here is hidden, I'm going to display a mobile menu at the top of our page, which means at that point in time, the mobile menu would be stacked on top of this main content section. So that's why I want to set the container layout of my page to be a column. So back in Bubble, what we're going to do is select that option there. And then what we're actually going to do is build out the right-hand side of our page first. So that was that main content area. So the very first thing I'm going to do is grab a group, which is going to house all of the elements on that side of our page. So if I scroll on down, I'm going to head to my containers menu. I'll grab a group and I'll add this onto my page here. Now, while we're working inside of our Bubble editor, I'm actually going to color code this group so I can easily see where it sits on my page. So in order to do that, I'm going to head to my appearance tab. I'm going to then detach the default style of this group, and I'm going to set the background style to be a flat color, and I'll update that to just be a light shade of red. Now, of course, when you go to preview or publish your app, you can remove that color, but for the time being, this is just going to help us see where everything sits on our page. I'm then going to make this group fully responsive. So that means that I need to jump into my layout tab, and I'm going to first of all update the container layout. Now inside of this group, I'm going to be stacking everything from top to bottom, so vertically down my page, which once again means that I'm going to need to select the column option as the container layout. And now from here, I can make this group fully responsive. So in order to make things fully responsive, I of course need to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leave the maximum width as infinite, so that way this group can take up as little or as much space as it needs on my page. Now we will come back and update the height and the margin settings later on, but for the time being, I'm just going to add all of the elements I want to display inside of this group. And look, when it comes to those elements, we are going to gradually keep adding to this throughout our tutorial today, but I would just like to show you a quick example of something I've already built inside of Bubble. So this is what I'm going to be modeling our tutorial off today. So within this overall red group here on the right hand side of my page, what I've actually added into this is this white group here. So this is going to display my company logo, my company name, and then my own profile photo. And then below this, we can add in any of the additional features that we need to display. So if we want to display our CRM, you can see here, this is where we're displaying all of our customers. And if we want to display expenses, I've added another group for that. And then right above my red group, I've gone and I've added a mobile menu, which I'll explain later on. You don't need to worry about that right now. But at this point in time, all I'm interested in building out is this white group inside of my red group. So you can see here, I'm displaying a series of information horizontally across my page. So that's why I've had to add an additional group inside of my red group. So if we jump back to our main Bubble editor, I'm going to grab an additional group here. I'll add this into my main group. And when it comes to this group, I'm going to jump to my appearance tab, just attach the default style of this, and I could set the background color to be a flat color, and I'll leave that as white. I'll then jump over to my layout tab, and I'll need to make this group fully responsive. So first of all, for the container layout, I'm going to set this as a row, because as you just saw, I had a couple of elements that were stacked horizontally within that. Then from here, if we scroll on down to our width, we're going to copy the exact same settings as our red group. We're going to make this fully responsive by unselecting it should be a fixed width. The minimum width will be 0 and the maximum width will be infinite. Now we can add those 3 elements inside of our group. So if we were looking at these 3 elements, As I said, I've got some information about a person's business or their company, so the logo and the company name, and then I've got their profile photo. Now, the way I want this to look is that I want all of the company's information stacked to the left of the page, and then I want the user's profile photo stacked to the right. So what I've actually done is I've added yet another group inside of my white group, which is this green group you see here. So that way I can connect the business logo and the business's name together. So that way they will be separate from the user's profile photo. And look, this is exactly how you can create responsive experiences inside a Bubble. But thankfully, if you're color coding your groups along the way, it just makes the process seem a lot more easy to interpret. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, to me, it just feels like I'm playing with Lego blocks. And look, I know it is tedious to add so many different groups onto your page, but this is truly how you can create beautiful responsive experiences inside a Bubble. And you'll see that come to life soon. But what I'm going to do right now is add that green group in, and then I can finally start adding in the content for each of my elements. So back in my main Bubble editor, inside of my white group here, what we're going to do is add yet another group. And look, I'm sure you're probably sick of me saying the word group right now, but this kind of looks like one of those Russian dolls where it's got so many different layers inside of it. But for this group, we're just going to change the color of this. We're going to detach the style, we'll give it a flat background color, and we'll make it a light shade of green. I'll then jump to my layout tab. And once again, inside of this group, I'm stacking two elements side by side. So that means I need to set the container layout to be a row because these are stacked horizontally across my page. I'm then going to make this group fully responsive as well. So I will unselect that this should be a fixed width, set the minimum width is 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. And it's now finally at this point, we can add our very first actual elements to our page. So if I scroll on up to my visual elements, I'm going to grab an image. I'll add this into my green group. And when it comes to this image here, what I'd like to do is display the logo for the company that someone works at. So thankfully in Bubble, what I can do is insert dynamic data and I can pull information from my database. And the information I'd like to reference is going to be the current user. So the current user is the person who is logged into their account and is currently viewing their dashboard page. I'd like to reference the company that they work for. And in this case, I'm going to pull the logo of that company. And now because this is a dynamic image, just a personal preference of mine is that I also like to select this option to process this image with ImgX, which just gives me the choice to tick this box here to resize and fit the dimensions of this image by cropping them, which just essentially means that if this image doesn't take up all of this space, it will stretch it out and crop it so that way it looks beautiful. And you'll see that come to life in a moment. I'm then going to close this and you'll see that that will validate. But what I need to do now is update the styling of this image. So if I scroll on down to my styling, I'm just going to detach the default style. I'm going to give this a solid border for the time being. So that way, if I click away, I can clearly see where this image sits on my page. I'll then select on my image again and just update the roundness of its borders to be 100. So that way it becomes a perfect circle. I'll then finally jump over to my layout tab. And for this image, I'm going to set the width of this to be 80 pixels. And I will keep this as a fixed value because I'm only ever going to want this to be 80 pixels. No larger and no smaller, regardless of the size of my page. It will always be that size. I'm also going to tick this option to keep this element's aspect ratio fixed at a 1:1 ratio. So that way it's 80 pixels by 80 pixels. And look, finally, I'll vertically align that in the center of my green group. And the last thing I'll need to do is just add 10 pixels of margin on the right, because beside this, I'm going to add a text element that displays the name of someone's company that they work for. So under my visual elements, I'll grab a text element, add this into my group here, and similar to my company logo, I'm going to insert dynamic data and just reference the current user, the company that they work for or own, the company name there. And look, when it comes to this text, I'd like it to stand out on my homepage. So I'm going to scroll on down to my styling, detach the default style. I'll update the font size to be 16, and I'm also going to choose to bold this text here. So that way it's slightly larger. I'll then jump to my layout tab here. And look, I'm going to make this text fully responsive. So I will unselect that should be a fixed width. Like always, I'll set the minimum width as 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite, so it can take up as little or as much space as it needs. And then finally, I'll get rid of all of this empty space in the height by setting the minimum height to be 0. We can then vertically align this in the center of my green group. And that is all of the elements I need to add inside of this green group. So what we can now do is close off all of this empty space that we no longer need. So I'm going to double click on my green group, head to my layout tab and first of all set the minimum height to be 0. And what that's going to do is collapse that group around all of the elements inside of it there. I'll then vertically align this group in the center of my white group. And then finally, while I'm here, I'm also just going to add 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, and then 20 on the left. And the last thing I'll need to add within this white group here at the top of my page is just the profile photo of the person who's currently logged into their own account. So what I'm going to do is actually just make a copy of this existing image here. I'll select in my white group. And this is kind of what I mean about white groups. I can't really see where it sits on my page, but look, this is the only white group I'm going to work with. But what I'm going to do is select in this and paste in another version of that image. Then if I jump over to my appearance tab, what I can do is update the data source for this image. So instead of displaying the current user, their company's logo, what I'm going to do is right click and clear that data. And instead I'm going to insert new dynamic data and display the current user, their profile photo. And once again, because this is a dynamic image, I'm going to select the option to process this image with ImgX. And I'm going to tick this choice to resize and fit the dimensions by cropping them. And look, once I've finished updating the data source for this image, I'm also just going to jump over to my layout tab and just update the size of this. I want this image to be slightly smaller than my company logo. So I'm going to set the width of this to be 50 pixels, and I won't need to change any additional settings here, but I would just like to add some margin around this image. So I'm going to give it 10 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the bottom, 20 on the left, and then also 20 on the right. Now, because that's all of the elements I want to add into my white group here, what I'm going to do is select on this group. And first of all, I'm going to set the minimum height to now equal 0, which means it's going to collapse around all of that empty space. And the very last thing I'd like to do for this group is just update the container alignment. So right now, all of my elements in this group are positioned to the left-hand side. Whereas what I'd like to do is make sure my green group stays on the left and then my profile photo stays on the right. So if I select this container alignment option here, known as space between, it's just going to ensure that within my white group, both of these elements are pushed to the side and there's an even amount of space between them, which there currently is, but I just want to make sure that that is taken care of. Now look, that's all I'm going to add into my red group at this point in time. As I mentioned, later on throughout our build today, any core feature we add in, whether it be invoicing, expense tracking, or our CRM, that's all going to be placed inside of this red group. So you can kind of think of this red group as the main content area of your QuickBooks clone. However, at this point in time, this red group doesn't really have much space, whereas I'd like it to take up all of the additional space on this page. So what I'm going to do is click on my red group here, and under our layout tab, if we were to scroll down to the bottom here, what you'll see is that by default, we have this option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it. What I'm actually going to do is uncheck that. And if I set the minimum height to be 0, it's just going to ensure that this group is going to take up the entire height of our page. So there's no restrictions on how high it can be. And that's all I need to change here. But this now begs the next question. How on earth are we going to build out the left-hand section of our page? So this menu that you see here. And look, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked. My approach to this is a slightly more advanced way inside a Bubble, but look, it doesn't take a whole lot more work to build. But today, the way I'm going to create this is by using what's known as a floating group. And look, I'm sure at this point in time, you're not only sick of me of saying the word group enough, but the last thing you want me to introduce is an entirely new concept. But look, I wouldn't do it unless it was necessary. If we scroll on down to our containers menu, obviously at this point in time, you're familiar with groups. But inside a Bubble, there's another element known as a floating group. And as the name suggests, if I was to add this group onto my overall page, so I'm going to add it at the top of my page here, this group is actually going to float over the top of my page. So it doesn't actually sit on or in my page. Instead, it hovers over the top of it, kind of like a pop-up, except floating groups are always visible. Whereas when you're working with elements like pop-ups, they're hidden by default and they only become visible when you call them within a workflow. Whereas today, this floating group is always going to be consistent. But obviously, the main problem we have right now with this floating group is that it's covering up a whole section of our page. We don't really want that. Instead, we want this whole red section and all of the elements inside of it to be pushed over to the side. So that way it sits nicely beside this floating group. And look, thankfully, it's a super straightforward process to do that. What I'm going to do today is give this floating group a width of 320 pixels. And then when it comes to our red group here, I'm going to add a margin to the left of 320 pixels. So that way it does push to the side and give enough room for this floating group. Now, most importantly, why on earth am I selecting 320 pixels? Look, if we were to scroll on up to our responsive tab, the smallest possible mobile device someone could use to view our application is 320 pixels. So I'm going to build around that. Now, 320 pixels is roughly the size of an iPhone 5. So it is quite an older device. If you're on something like an iPhone 15 or a recent Samsung Galaxy, it's going to provide more space. But look, you are going to get people using an iPhone 5. Some people just haven't come out of the Stone Age yet. So what we need to do is jump to our UI builder here. I'm going to double click on my floating group. And the first thing I will need to do is just give this a container layout. Now, inside of this group here, as you can see, all of my elements are stacked from the top down. So for the container layout, I'm going to set this to be a column. And then from here, what I can do is give this group a width, which I can see it currently is 320 pixels. But I just want to make sure that this 320 pixels is fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0. And instead of leaving an infinite maximum width, I'm going to set the maximum width to be 320 pixels. And look, that's just going to ensure that if this group does need to shrink in size, it will be able to do that. Then from here, I'm going to quickly digress and click back on my red group. And if I open up my layout tab and scroll down to my margins, I'm going to give this a left margin of 320 pixels. And as you'll now see, we have the perfect amount of space to display our floating group. So although this floating group is technically hovering over the top of our page, it kind of just looks like it's a part of the page anyway. Your end users aren't going to know it actually isn't a part of the page and that it floats over it. To them, it's all just going to look like one seamless application. And so at this point in our tutorial, what I'd like to do is actually build this floating group out. So we're going to first of all jump to our appearance tab and we're going to update the name of this. I'm going to call this floating group left nav menu. And I can see I've got quite a bad typo there, so I'm going to fix that. But look, this is essentially the navigation menu that's going to be on the left-hand side of our page. So in order to navigate between all of the features of our QuickBooks clone today, we're going to need to use this menu here. I'll then jump back into my editor because what I'd like to do is update the background color of this floating group. So I'm going to scroll on down to my styling and update the color from white to be a custom color code I have here, which if you'd like that color code, it's 393A3D. And look, this is the same color code that QuickBooks uses. I then also like this floating group to take up the entire height of my page, similar to my red group. So if we jump to our layout tab, what I'm going to do is set the minimum height to be 0, but I'm going to uncheck this default setting to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it. And it's finally at this point in time, you can start to see my grand vision for this page coming to life. As I assured you at the start of this tutorial, there was a method to my madness, but this is where you're really going to start to see your first glimpse of your QuickBooks clone. So if we were now going to try and build out this left-hand navigation menu, the first thing I'll need to add to that is a QuickBooks logo as well as a button here. So what I'm going to do is grab an image element, add it into my floating group, and I'm going to upload a custom QuickBooks logo. And look, I've already taken the time to upload the same image I'm about to use into a Google Drive, which of course I'll be sure to include a link to this within the description of this video. But right now I'm going to use the clear QuickBooks logo here. So it's the QuickBooks logo white, and when I upload this, it's just going to look nice on this background color. And look, once I've uploaded my logo, as you can see, it's incredibly distorted. So we need to fix that by jumping over to our layout tab. And what I'm going to do is check this option to keep this elements aspect ratio fixed. And that's just automatically going to fix the aspect ratio of this image. I'm then going to set the width of this image to be 150 pixels. So that way it's smaller. But look, I am going to keep this as a fixed width. I don't want it to expand out or shrink down based on the size of my page. I always want it to be this exact width here. Then finally, what I'm going to do is just add 30 pixels of margin at the top and 20 on the left. So that way it doesn't touch the borders of my floating group. And then below this, what we're going to do is create our own custom button. So as you can see within QuickBooks here, they have a circle button which displays the word new, but it also has a little icon inside of it. Now, if you've been using Bubble for any period of time, or if you are very new to Bubble, this is probably a good lesson for you. When you're using a button element, you're unable to actually add an icon into it. You can only add text. Even if I was to add some custom HTML formatting, it's not going to display that inside of a button. So I might quickly just add this in now for the sake of our tutorial. You don't need to do this. But in theory, if I was using a text element, this would display a little plus icon. Whereas as you can see, this HTML formatting here is doing nothing but displaying complete gibberish. So what we need to do is actually build out our own custom button. But how can we do that? Look, at this point in our tutorial today, I feel like I've been the ultimate hype man for using groups inside a bubble. And look, I'm going to double down on that. Groups not only have so many superpowers, but they do possess another capability, and that is that you can use them as functional buttons. So you can trigger workflows when groups are clicked, and you can create conditions when they're hovered, so that way they have the exact same effects as buttons. So if we were to build our own custom button today, what we're going to do is scroll on down to our containers menu, grab a group and add it into our existing floating group. Now for this group, what I'm actually going to do is update the name of this, because later on throughout our tutorial, we're going to trigger a workflow whenever this group is clicked. So I'm going to call this group new button, because this is the button that's going to display the word new in it. I'll then jump back over into Bubble, and for this group, I'm going to detach the default style of it. I'm not going to give it a background color. However, I will give this a border, and I'm going to make that a solid border. Now for this border, I'm going to make this white, and I'm going to make the width of this 2, so that way it's slightly thicker. I'm also then going to set the roundness of this border to be 20, so that way it has curved edges. And then we're going to jump over to our layout tab and make this group fully responsive. So if we first of all update the container layout for this, I can choose between either a row or a column. Look, for this group, I'm only going to add one element into it, and that's going to be a text element that will contain both of my icon and my text. So it doesn't really matter. I'm not stacking elements vertically or horizontally. There's only one element inside of this group. Now, I'm personally just going to choose the row option, but you wouldn't be wrong if you selected the column choice. But from here, I'm then going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. We'll set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So now this group is fully responsive. And in a moment, we're going to come back and update the height and the margins, so that way it ends up looking exactly like this button here. But for now, what I need to do is add my text element inside of this group. So if I scroll on up, I'm going to head to my visual elements. I'm going to grab a text element, and I'll add this into my group here. Now for this text element, I think the first thing I should do for the sake of our tutorial today is just update the color of this to be white, just so that way you can see what I'm typing in without any difficulty. But what I'd like to do is obviously display the word new. But before that, I want to display my little plus icon. And so what I'm going to do today is use some basic HTML formatting to bring that to life. So if you're brand new to Bubble, what we're going to do is just quickly remove that new text. Don't worry, I'm going to add it in again in a moment. But if you want to display an icon inside of a text element, all you need to do is use this basic HTML formatting. And trust me, I hate code and I really struggle with HTML. But this is the one thing I find incredibly easy. All we need to do is add an open square bracket, the letters FA, and then a closed square bracket. And this is going to tell Bubble, hey, we're about to add a custom icon here. Be ready to format that as an actual icon for us. Then we can type in the name of the icon we need. So I'm going to say that this is the plus icon. And then from here, I'm going to close off my HTML formatting, which looks the exact same as opening it up. So I'm going to put an open square bracket. I will need to put a /, and then follow that with the letters FA and then a closed square bracket. And then voila, there is our plus icon. It was super straightforward. I'll then add in a space and type in the word new. And if I scroll on down to my styling here, I'll detach the default style, because I'd also like to bold this text and then align this in the center of the text element. Now look, from here, we're going to need to jump to our layout tab and make this overall text element fully responsive. So we'll need to unselect that this should be a fixed width. We'll set the minimum width as 0, leave the maximum width as infinite, and then we'll do the exact same thing for the minimum height. So I'm going to set that to be 0, and it will just collapse around all of the text inside of it there. Now, while we're in our layout tab, I'm also going to vertically align this text element in the center of my group. And then finally, I'll add 5 pixels of margin at the top, 5 on the bottom, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right. And that is everything we need to add into this group. So I can now select on that group that's going to act as our button. And for the height, I can set this to be 0. And as you'll see, once that collapses around our text, it takes the same formatting and structure as the real world QuickBooks button. But I'm also just going to scroll on down and add 30 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And if I was to click away, I'm very happy with how that button looks. Now look, when this button is clicked, I'd like to display a drop-down menu, but before we build that out, what I'd like to do is actually just create all of our menu options here. So for each feature that we create within our application today, I'm gonna add an option within our navigation menu here. So that way we can either navigate between that feature or jump between the page where we can access that. And so what I'm gonna need to do is add a couple of different text elements in. So if I jump back to my main editor, I'll head to my visual elements, I'll grab a text element, and for this text, I'm just going to detach the default style of this, update the font size to be 18. I'm also going to choose to set the color of this text to be white, and then finally, I'll bold this text as well. And then look from here, of course, we'll need to make this fully responsive. So if we jump to our layout tab, I can unselect that that's a fixed width, set the minimum width to 0, leave the maximum width as infinite. And look, I sound like a broken record when I say that time and time again, but this is how we can create a truly responsive experience. I'm then also going to set the minimum height to be 0. And that, of course, will just ensure that it collapses around all of the empty space within this element. And then finally, I'm going to add a top margin of 30, no bottom margin, but a left margin of 20 and a right margin of 20. And from here, instead of having to rebuild every single text element from scratch, we can just make a copy of our existing element, and it's going to copy across all of the exact same design settings. All I really need to change here is the actual text itself. So I'm going to have this display the word customers. And I might also just like to reduce the top margin here, so that way these two text elements sit closer together. So just within my layout tab, instead of having a top margin of 30, I'm going to set that as a top margin of 20. And then we're going to make a copy of this. I'm going to update this to display the word expenses. And finally, we're going to copy this 2 more times. This time, we're going to display the word invoices. And then for the very last time, I'm going to have this display the word settings. Now, when it comes to this navigation menu, what I'd like to do right now is create a workflow that runs whenever someone clicks on this settings text. Because at this point in time in our tutorial, our settings page does exist. Because if you remember, when someone registers an account, I'd set them through to our settings page. So what I'd like to do is actually click on this settings text, choose to add a workflow here. And within this workflow, it's super straightforward. I'm going to select from the navigation event, choose the go to page action, and set the destination page to be my settings page there. Now, because this workflow is a navigation workflow, what I'd also like to do is color code this. So that way I know that any workflow that is a particular color is related to a particular aspect of my Quickbooks clone. So if I select on the workflow trigger, I'm going to select that the event color here should be red. And so today, whenever I create a navigation workflow, I'm also going to update its event color to also be red. And look, at this point, we're almost finished working through this module. The very last thing I'd like to do is just create the drop-down menu that's going to be displayed whenever someone clicks on this button here. So if I was to jump over to my existing bubble editor here, what I've done is I've created a drop-down menu, which is another group element. So whenever someone clicks this button here, this group will display. So someone can either choose to create a new expense, a new invoice, or a new customer. And so that's what we're going to build out right now. So if we jump back to our main bubble editor here, what we're going to do is scroll on down to our containers menu, and we're going to grab a group element, and we'll add this below our button here. And when it comes to this group, the first thing I'll need to do is actually update the name of this. I'm going to call this the group new drop-down menu. And so because this group is related to my button, which displays the text new, and it's the drop-down menu, that name makes sense to me, but you can call it whatever you want. I'm also then just going to scroll on down to my styling and detach the default style because I'd like to give this a flat background color and I want to leave that as white. I'm then going to set the roundness of this group's borders to be 10, so that way it has some curved edges. And then finally, I'll jump over to my layout tab so we can update the responsive settings of this group. But before I do that, I just need to give this group a container layout. So as you saw within this group, I had a couple of different text options and they were all stacked from the top down. So that means if I'm stacking elements vertically, I'm going to need to select that the container layout should be a column. I'll then make the width settings fully responsive. So as you probably guessed, I will uncheck that this should be a fixed width. The minimum width will be 0 and the maximum width will be infinite. And look, I'll come back and update the height and the margin settings in a moment. From here though, I just want to add 3 text elements into this group. So I'm going to scroll on up, head to my visual elements and grab a text element. And similar to the example I'd shown you before each text element, I just want to display a little icon that's relevant to that option. So before the new expense option, I got a little calculator here. And the process of adding that in was of course the exact same as the process of building out the plus icon in our button here. So what I'm going to need to do is add some custom HTML formatting. So similar to before, I'm going to put an open square bracket followed by the letters FA and then a closed square bracket. Then from here, I'll need to add the name of the icon. Now I've completely forgotten what the name of the calculator icon is. I mean, in theory, it should just be calculator, but sometimes the icons are spelled differently. So in order to get the correct name, what I could do is just grab an icon, add this onto my page anywhere, and then search for the calculator icon. And then right here below the FA text, this is the name of the icon. So I can copy and paste this. And look, I can see that it is just called the calculator. It's pretty straightforward. But what I'm going to do is then select on my text element. Beside my square brackets, I'm going to paste in the name of that icon. And then I'm going to have to close off this HTML formatting. So I'll add yet another open square bracket, a /, the letters FA, and then a closed square bracket. And that's going to format that as a calculator. Then from here, I can type in the word new expense. Now for this text, I'm also going to scroll on down and detach the default style because I'd like to update the size of this. I really want it to stand out a bit more than it currently is. So I'm going to set the font size here to be 16. I'm going to choose to bold that. And then I'll just need to make this text fully responsive. So if I jump to my layout tab, I'll unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leaving the maximum width as infinite. I'll do the exact same thing for my minimum height. So I'm going to set that to be 0. And then finally, I'm going to add 20 pixels of margin at the top, 10 on the left, and 10 on the right there. Now look, to save me having to rebuild that entire text element from scratch, I'm just going to make a copy of that. Only in this instance, I'm going to need to update the text here. And look, I'm just going to move this to the previous position so that way it sits above my calculator icon. I will delete that icon in a moment, but I just need it so I can find out the name of each icon for our text. So if I jump to my appearance tab here, I'm just going to delete all of this text except for the first square brackets with the letters FA. Then what I'd like to do is just add in a money symbol as an icon. So what I'm going to do is just select on my calculator icon and search for money. I'm going to click on this. And I can see that this has not updated. So perhaps what I could do is just delete that icon and add another one in. And if I type in the word money, let's see if this updates. And there it is. So this icon is in fact just called money. So I'm going to copy that, select on my text element, paste in the name of the icon, and then add in my open square bracket, my /, the letters FA, and then a closed square bracket. Then I'm going to add in a space. And then finally, I'll type in the words new invoice. Now, when it comes to this text element, what I'd like to do is just close off the gap between both of my elements within my group. So I'm going to select on my new text element, which is my new invoice, jump to my layout tab, and I'm just going to set the top margin to be 10 pixels, not 20. And then finally, I'm just going to make one last copy of this text element. I'll delete my icon there. And for my last text element, I'd like to display the words new user. And for my icon, I already know that it's just the standard user icon. So you'll just need to type in the word user. Then from here, I'll just close off my HTML formatting, the same as before, and you'll see that that will format as a user. I'll then add in a space and type in the words new customer. And because this is the very last element I'd like to add into my group here, I'm just going to add some margin at the bottom of this. So within my layout tab, I'm just going to give it a bottom margin of 20 pixels, but that is all I'll need to change. From here, I can then select on my overall group, head to its layout tab, and set the minimum height to be 0, so that way it collapses around all of my elements inside of it. And then finally, I'll also add in 10 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left and 20 on the right, so that way this group sits in line with all of the existing elements within my navigation menu. Now look, at this point in time, this group would be visible by default on my page, whereas that's not the experience I want to create. Instead, I want this group to be hidden, and I only want it to be shown whenever someone clicks on my button here. And I want this group to slide down and show. So what we need to do is actually jump back to our layout tab for this group and untick this option to make this element visible on page load, which means that by default, it's going to be hidden. I'm also going to tick this option to collapse this element when it's hidden. So that way it doesn't take up any empty space when it's not being shown. And then finally, I'm also going to tick this last option to animate the collapse operation, and I'm going to leave it as the slide up down option. And what this just means is that when this group is shown, it's going to slide down or slide up. But now if I was to refresh my page, what you'll notice is that within our editor, that group is no longer visible by default. So this is what our application is actually going to look like when we run a preview of it. Now, if you want to view that group again inside of your editor, just head over to your elements tree here. You'll see that group and just click this little eye icon and it'll display it. But what we need to do is create a way to make this group functional for our end users. So when this button is clicked here, I'm going to display this group. So if I double click on this button, which is our group new button. So this is technically a group, but we're using it as a custom button. What I'm going to do is add a new workflow when this is clicked. And inside this workflow, it's super straightforward. I'm just going to type in the word toggle and I'm going to choose to toggle an element. Now look, toggling an element just means that if the group is hidden, it'll show it. And if it's being shown, it will hide it. So Bubble's going to take care of all of the heavy lifting for us. And that element is of course going to be our group new drop-down menu. Now look, for this workflow, I am also going to color code this. Any of my drop-down menus today, I'm going to make them blue. So that way I know that these are all related to one specific feature. And thankfully, after building out that workflow, that is absolutely everything I wanted to cover at this point in our tutorial. I know it doesn't seem like much, but right now we've built the basis for the entire QuickBooks application today. Everything else we build is going to be an extension of this page here. And look, if you were to run a preview of this, you're not going to see a whole lot happening right now. At this point in time, all I can just see is my company's information as well as my own profile photo. And if I was to click this new button, that group's going to toggle, or I can hide it if I would like. But look, from here, what I'd like to do is just jump back into my Notion checklist and tick off that we've finished building out the core of our dashboard page. And as I mentioned, everything else we create today is going to be an extension of what we've just created. Working our way through the list of features within my checklist here, we're finally going to move along to, I guess you could say, one of the first real core features of our QuickBooks clone today, and that's being able to create something like a CRM within our platform. So within this, we're going to allow businesses to actually add customers to their account. Now look, I am going to break this down into a couple of different sections, just so that way it's not so overwhelming. And within this first section, we're just going to learn how we can create a new customer entry inside of our database. But before we open up Bubble, what I'd like to do is show you a preview of how the whole experience is going to look. So if I jump over into a separate browser here, this is a preview of a QuickBooks clone I've already prepared in advance. Now over in my navigation menu here, if I was to select on the Customers tab, it's going to change the group that's displayed within our main content area. And of course, you can see a list of customers within this. But if I wanted to create a new customer for my business, I could either select this button here, or I could open up my drop-down menu and choose to create a new customer. This pop-up will display. I can add their details in and I can choose to save that there, and a new entry will be added into my list here. Now within our first module, I'm just going to focus on how we can actually build out this pop-up. Then within our next few modules, we're going to build out this section of our page. But right now, I'm just focused on actually creating a customer inside of our database. So what we'll need to do is jump over into our main Bubble editor here, and I'm going to open up my dashboard page. Now on this page, I'm going to need to add a pop-up element. So if I scroll all the way down to my containers, I'm going to grab a pop-up. I'll add this onto my page here, and I'm going to call this pop-up customer. I can see I just have a small typo that I need to fix there. Now, when it comes to pop-ups, these are just like groups that sit over the top of your page, but they're hidden by default. So we are going to need to build out a workflow in a moment that actually shows this pop-up. But of course, before we do that, I'd like to design everything inside of it. Now, because a pop-up is like a group, the first thing we'll need to do here is jump to our layout tab and set a container layout. Now, as you saw in my example before, I had a bunch of input fields that sat inside of this pop-up, and these were positioned from the top down. So I'm going to need to set the container layout to be a column. When it comes to the width settings of this pop-up, it's currently fixed at 320 pixels. Whereas what I'd like to do is make this pop-up fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, but when it comes to the maximum width, I'm not going to leave that as infinite, because as you can see right now, it's taking up the entire width of my page. So what I'm actually going to do is set the maximum width to be 800 pixels. Now look, there's no scientific reason why I selected 800. I just think that that's a good size to work with. But if you wanted to make that 1000 or even 600, feel free to do that. But at 800 pixels, it just tells Bubble that at the largest possible size, my pop-up can't be any wider than what you see right here. Now, of course, we are going to come back and update the height settings in a moment. But before we do that, we need to add all of our elements inside of this pop-up. And the very first thing we need to do is just add a title at the top here. So I'm going to scroll on up to my visual elements and grab a text element here. I'll add this into my pop-up, and this text element is just going to display the word customer. Now for this text element, I'm also just going to scroll on down to my styling, detach the default style, and I'm going to set the font size to be 20. I'll align this text in the center, and I'm also going to choose to bold this, so that way it really stands out. We'll then need to make this fully responsive, so it takes up the entire width of this pop-up. So within my layout tab here, I will unselect that should be a fixed width. As you probably guessed, the minimum width will be 0, the maximum width will be infinite, and then we'll need to do the exact same thing for our height. So the minimum height will be 0, and then the maximum height will be infinite. Then from here, I'm going to add 30 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And that's just going to ensure that this text element won't touch the borders of my pop-up. Then below this, what we can do is start building out all of the input fields. And above each input field, I just want to display a smaller little text element just to indicate what information needs to be added into each field. So I'm going to grab yet another text element. I'll add this in here. And for this very first heading, I'm going to have this display the words contact name. And for this text, I am also just going to detach the default style, although the only thing I'm going to change is that I would like to bold this text. I'm not going to update the font size or the alignment, but of course I will need to make this fully responsive. So within my layout tab, we'll uncheck that should be a fixed width. The minimum width will be 0, the maximum width will be infinite, and of course the minimum height will also be 0. I'm going to add the exact same margins that I added to my first text element to our new one here as well. So I'm going to put 30 pixels of margin at the top, 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And now below this, I can add an input field where someone can add the contact name of the customer that they want to create within their business. So if I scroll on down to my input fields, we're going to grab a standard input field and add this into our pop-up. Now for this input field, the very first thing I'm going to do is update the name of this. I'm going to call this input customer contact name. Just so that way when I build out a workflow in a moment to actually create a new customer in our database, I know exactly where we're storing the contact name for that customer. Now, while we're also working on this input field, I'm going to jump to my layout tab and make this fully responsive. So once again, we will uncheck that should be a fixed width. The minimum width will be 0. The maximum width will be infinite. And look, I'm quite happy to leave the height as is, which is fixed at 48 pixels. I don't need this input field to be any larger or any smaller, so I'm just going to leave it as that. The final thing we will do though is just add in 20 pixels of margin on both the left and the right hand sides. And then from here, what we'll need to do is replicate this exact same experience again. So in order to streamline that process, I'm going to select my heading in my input field. I'm going to make a copy of these here, and I'm just going to quickly rearrange these. So I'm going to put the heading above the input field. And for this second heading, I'm just going to call this company name, or I should say I'm going to have it display the word company name. And I also am just going to quickly update the top margin. I don't want it to be 30 pixels. I want this to sit closer to the actual input field above it. So within my layout tab, I'm just going to set the top margin to be 20. It's not a huge change, but it's just going to keep everything nice and compact. I will, of course, though, just need to update the name of the input field. So right now, this is called input customer contact name. I'm going to call this input customer company name. And then from here, we're going to select both the text element and the input field, make another copy of those, move the text element above the input field, and I'm going to have this text element display the words contact email, because of course this is where someone can add an email address. And of course, when it comes to the input field, I'll also update this. So I'm going to call this customer email. Now for this input field, contrary to what you might think, I'm also not going to update the content format. So I'm not going to have this be an email field. Instead, I'm going to leave this as text. And look, the reason for that is because I'm not actually registering an account for someone. So I don't need to store this as a valid email. All I need to do is store it as text because I'm only going to display it as text inside of our application today. So we're going to leave that as it is. There is, however, just one last field I'd like to add to this pop-up. So I'm going to select on my text, select on my input field, and make one last copy. And for our text, I'm going to have this display the words contact number, and then I'm going to select on my input field and also update this. I'm going to call this customer contact number, or perhaps I should even say customer phone number. So that way it's just more clear to me when I build out my workflow. Now look, that is everything I wanted to add into my pop-up when it comes to my input fields. So I'm just going to add a button at the bottom of this. So if I scroll on up to my visual elements, I'll grab a button, add this into my pop-up here, and I'm going to have this button display the word save. I'm then going to jump to my layout tab, position this to the right-hand side of my pop-up. And while we're here, I'm also just going to give this 30 pixels of margin at the top, 30 on the bottom, 20 on the left, and 20 on the right. But I won't need to update any of the dimensions of the button itself. I'm quite happy with how they are. Now, because this is the very last element that I need to add into my pop-up, I can select on my pop-up, open up my layout tab, and now make sure the minimum height is 0. And of course, when this default option is selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's just going to collapse nicely around all of our elements here. And at this point, our pop-up is pretty much done. Before we go and build out the workflow to actually create a new customer in our database, what we need to do is build out the workflow that's going to display this pop-up. So if I just click away and close my pop-up, what I'm going to do is head to my elements tree and open up my group new dropdown here. And of course, within this, we have a text option known as new customer. So I'm going to select this text, open up my appearance tab, and choose to add a workflow. And within this workflow, what I'm going to do is show that pop-up whenever this text is clicked. So if I head to my element actions, I'm going to choose to show an element, and that element is of course my pop-up customer. And for this workflow here, what I'm going to do is just select on the workflow trigger. And because this is related to my CRM or customer feature inside of my QuickBooks clone today, I'm just going to update the event color to be green, just so I can easily distinguish what is the customer facing feature. Another thing I should point out is that, of course, whenever you build out a workflow on your main desktop navigation menu here, you also need to recreate that workflow in your mobile menu. So if I quickly just head up to my elements tree and display my group focus mobile dropdown, I'll need to recreate the exact same workflow on my second text element. So I'm going to select on this, add a new workflow, and rebuild the exact same experience. So I'm going to head to my element actions, I'll show an element, and that element is of course my pop-up customer. And once again, I'm going to select on the workflow trigger and set the event color here to be green. Now finally from here, there's one very last thing we need to do in this section of our course today, and that's actually build out the workflow that's going to create a new customer entry in our database. So I'm just going to quickly close that focus group, head to my pop-up and open this. I'm going to double click on my save button here, add a workflow when someone clicks this. And within this workflow, I'm going to do a couple of things. The first thing I'd like to do is obviously create a new entry in our database and store the details of a customer. So what I'm going to do is head to my data tab. I'm going to choose to create a new thing. And the type of thing I'd like to create is going to be a customer. I'm then going to add all of my fields here. And similar to whenever we've created something in the past, we just need to match all of the data fields from our database to the relevant input fields on our page. So for the company name, I'm just going to type in the word company and reference the input customer company name, its value. For the contact email, this will be the input customer email, its value. For the contact name, I'll type in name and reference the input customer contact name. It's super straightforward. And for the number, this will be the input customer phone number. But finally, what I'll also need to do is link this customer to the business that has just created it. Because later on, when I display a long list of all of the customers that a business has created or owns, I obviously just want to make sure that the customers that are being displayed within that list only belong to that business. I don't want customers from another business being shown. So this is the importance of this field here. So for the original business field that this customer belongs to, it's going to equal the value of the current user, the company that they work for. And that's all we need to build out for this step in our workflow. The only other thing we'll need to do is, of course, just hide our pop-up. So if we add an additional step here, we'll head to our element actions, and we're not going to show an element. Instead, we're going to hide one. And that element will, of course, be our pop-up customer. And finally, there is one last step. I'd just like to reset the values of all of the input fields here. So let's say if someone starts a business from scratch and they want to add, I don't know, 3 or 5 customers at once. What they're going to do is select on the new customer button. It's going to open this pop-up. They'll add the details in and click save. And that's of course going to create a new customer in our database, and then it's going to hide that pop-up. But let's say if they immediately want to create another customer, they click on that button again. The pop-up would be displayed, but all of that existing information would still sit in these input fields. So that's why we need to take the time to reset the values of these input fields here, just to make sure they're all blank whenever a pop-up is opened again. So within our workflow tab, we're going to add one last step here. We're going to type in the word reset, and we're going to reset relevant inputs. And Bubble's just going to take care of all of that for us. Now finally, because this workflow is once again related to my customer feature, I'm going to select on the workflow trigger and set the event color to be green. And look, that is everything we need to build out within this section of our course right now. I think this was relatively straightforward and easy. And that's because I just wanted to break it down into multiple different sections today, just so it's more manageable to create. But let's run a preview of my application now, and we can see what the whole experience looks like creating a new customer in our database. Over in a preview of my QuickBooks dashboard here, I'm currently logged into my account working for my company. What I'm going to do is select this new button here. I'm going to select to add a new customer. It's going to display my pop-up, and I'm going to add a customer called John Smith. They're going to work for Test Enterprises. Their email will be john@testenterprises.com, and their contact number is just going to be a random string of numbers. I'm going to choose to save this here. It's going to close that pop-up. And look, we obviously haven't built out the list yet to display all of the customers. However, if I was to jump back into Bubble and open up my data tab, and if I select my app data menu here and choose from all of my customers, I can now see that that entry has in fact been created. So we can see John Smith with all of his details, and it is linked to my business. Just back in my Notion checklist, we can tick off that we finished building out the first section of our overall CRM feature. And look, it's super exciting to see some of these features finally coming to life. As we continue working our way through the list of features in my checklist here, right now we're going to build an extension of our previous module, and within this in particular, we're going to focus on creating a way to display all of the customers that a business has created. Now, once again, before I jump into Bubble and start building this out, I'd just like to show you a quick preview of what this is going to look like from an end user experience. So if we jump over into an existing application I've already built in a separate browser here, this is my QuickBooks dashboard. Now, by default, it's displaying some data visualizations, but look, I'm not going to touch base on that right now. What I'm interested in showing you is what happens when I click this customer's text. So what you're going to see first of all is that the group that's being displayed in our main content area, so this red group, has been changed. So it's hidden our data visualizations, and now it's displaying this group, which contains information about all of my customers. Now, inside of this, I can see things like their contact name, their company name, and their contact number. And when I eventually click on this, it's going to display the full information for that customer. But for now, it's just an overall snapshot of everyone in my CRM. If I really wanted, I could also filter a customer down by their name. And so we've just added some additional functionality into this CRM. So the first thing we're going to need to build out is this actual group, and of course, the list of customers inside of it. So let's jump over into our main Bubble editor here, and we're going to scroll on down to our containers menu, grab a group, and add this into my red group, so my main content area. Now, when it comes to this group, the first thing I'll do is just update the name of this to be called Group Customers, and then I'm also going to just attach the default style of this, because if I scroll on down, I'm going to give it a flat background color, and then I'll also give it a solid border and set the roundness of its borders to be 10. And now for the next step, we can make this group fully responsive. So if we jump over to our layout tab, before we update any of the width settings, we'll of course need to give this a container layout. Now, as you saw in my example before, I had a series of elements that were stacked from the top down. So I'm going to set the container layout to be a column. Then I'm going to have this group take up the entire width of this red section on my page. So I will uncheck that this should be a fixed width. We'll set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So of course it can take up as little or as much space as possible. Now we will come back and update the height and the margin settings in a moment. But for now, what I'd like to do is build out all of the elements you see inside of this group. And look, when it comes to this group over in my separate browser, this is how I built things out. So at the top, you can see I've got a purple group that sits inside of this. And the reason I've had to add this purple group in is because I do have two elements that sit side by side, so horizontally across my page. So this is the first section I'd like to build out. So I'm going to jump to my main bubble editor, and within my white group, I'm going to add another group. And when it comes to this group, the first thing I'm going to do, similar to what you saw before, is just update the background color so I can easily see where it sits on my page. So we're going to detach the default style, give it a flat background color, and I'll keep things consistent with my example before and make this a light shaded purple. I'll then jump over to my layout tab and make this fully responsive. But of course, before we do that, we need to give this a container layout. And in this case, because I'm stacking two elements side by side, so horizontally across my page, the container layout will need to be a row. Then we'll make this fully responsive. So we will uncheck that this should be a fixed width. We'll set the minimum width as 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. Now inside of this, I'm going to add a text element and a button. So let's scroll on up to our visual elements, grab that text element and add it into our group. And for this text element, it's just going to display the word customers. And of course, I'd like this text to look something like a heading. So I'm going to scroll on down, detach the default style, and I'm going to make the font size here 20. I'll also choose to bold this. And then of course, I'll make this fully responsive. So similar to before, I'll jump to my layout tab, uncheck it should be a fixed width, set the minimum width as 0, the maximum width is infinite, and we'll do the exact same thing for the height. I'm going to set the minimum height to 0. I'll also vertically align this in the center of my purple group, and I'm not going to add any margin around this particular text element. Beside this though, what I would like to do is just add a button element. So if I head to my visual elements once again, I'll grab a button, I'll add it into this group, and for this button, I'm going to have it display the words new customer. And of course, as you can see right now, it's pushed those two words onto a separate line. So what I'll need to do is increase the width of this element. So within my layout tab, I'm going to unselect that it should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width as 0, but I'm going to give it a maximum width of 180 pixels because that is enough room to add everything I need inside of this. If you really wanted, it also wouldn't be entirely wrong if you just set this as a fixed width of 180 pixels. So if you just tick that, that would be fine. But look, either or is going to work for this situation. When it comes to the height though, I'm going to leave it as is, but I'm also going to vertically align this in the center of my purple group. And then finally, just add 20 pixels of margin to the left. Now, because that's everything I want to add into this purple group, I'm going to select on the overall purple group, head to my layout tab, and now set the minimum height to be 0. It's going to collapse perfectly around both of my elements inside of it there. And then I'm also going to scroll on down to my margins and just add 20 at the top, none on the bottom, but 20 on the left and 20 on the right. Now, while we're building this group out with this green button in it, which adds a new customer when clicked, we're obviously going to need to create the workflow that triggers our pop-up to display whenever someone does click on this. So I'm going to quickly click on this button here, jump to my appearance tab and add a new workflow. And look, this workflow is going to be the exact same as the previous workflow I built out where we display our pop-up to add a new customer. So I'm going to head on down to my element actions and just choose to show an element. And that element is of course going to be my pop-up customer. Now, because this workflow is related to my customer or CRM feature, I'm going to select on the workflow trigger and set the event color to be green. Perfect. Jumping back into my design tab, the next thing I'll need to add in is just going to be a standard input field, which is just going to allow someone to type in the name of a customer that they would like to filter our list by. So if I scroll on down to my input fields, I'm going to grab a standard input field. I'll add this below our purple group. And look, for this input field, what I'm going to do first of all is update the name of this. I'm going to call this input customer search. And while we're in our appearance tab, I'm also going to update the placeholder text. So this is the text that is temporarily displayed until someone starts typing in this field. And look, when it comes to this text, I'm just going to have it display the words search for customer ... And so that's just going to prompt someone to start typing in this if they ever want to filter their list down. And they're going to jump into my layout tab because I'd like to update the responsive settings and the design of this input field. What I'm actually going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed width. I am going to make it fully responsive. So I'm going to set the minimum width as 0. However, I don't really need all of this width here to type in a customer's name. So I'm personally just going to set the maximum width at 320 pixels. There's no real scientific reason why I selected that. However, if you want to make it, let's say 400 pixels, feel free to go ahead and do that. But I just think 320 is enough. I'm then also just going to quickly add 20 pixels of margin at the top, none on the bottom, but 20 on the left and 20 on the right. And I won't need to change any of the height settings. It's already perfect as is. And look, below this is where things are going to get interesting. We're going to add a list of all of the customers we need to display within a business's CRM. So whenever you're displaying a list of items inside a bubble, you're going to need to use an element known as a repeating group. Now, a repeating group, as the name would suggest, is kind of just like a group that repeats itself. So if you ever need to display a list of items, a repeating group is going to be the exact element you need to use. The power of repeating groups is that they can actually fetch data from your information and display a long list of things. So I always use the example of if you were recreating an Instagram clone and you wanted to build the homepage feed, a repeating group is the element you would use. So each cell in your repeating group would be its own individual Instagram post. Now the way a repeating group works is that over in your appearance tab, you give it a data source. So you tell Bubble, hey, in this list of items, I want you to display a list of customers that belong to a particular business or an organization. Then what you need to do from there is design the very first cell in your repeating group, and Bubble will automatically populate all of the remaining cells and display all of the customers that belong to that business. Whether there be 5 customers or 500, a repeating group is going to display as many or as few as there are in our database. But look, when it comes to repeating group, if you're brand new to Bubble, they can be a little bit overwhelming to set up. But of course, it's my job to make things as simple as possible for you. So I'm going to walk you through the steps. So the first thing we're going to do is give it a data source. So for the type of content I want to display in this list, I'm going to display a list of customers. Super straightforward. But what we also need to do is give this a data source. So we need to tell Bubble, out of all the customers that have been created in our database, which specific customers do we want to display in this list? And in this case today, we're going to perform a search in our database for all of the customers where the business that they belong to, so where the OG business field equals the same business as the current user, their company. So the current user is the person who is logged in. And of course, if they work for a company, what we're going to do is display all of the customers that belong to that company. And that's all we need to change for this data source. It's super straightforward. The next thing we need to do is update the number of rows and columns that this repeating group is going to display. So right now you can see that we have a fixed number of rows at 4. Now that's not the experience we want to create today. Instead, we want to display as few or as many customers as there are that fit this data source. So let's say your business only has 1 customer. You want this repeating group to display 1 entry. If you've got 10 customers, you want it to display 10 and so on. So what we're going to do is unselect that this should be a fixed number of rows. However, I am going to keep the number of columns fixed as 1. And the reason for that is because I'd only ever like 1 customer to be displayed on 1 line. So that's all we need to change here. But we also need to make this element fully responsive. So if we jump over to our layout tab, I'm just going to quickly move my property editor to the side. What we're going to need to do is first of all update the container layout like we would with any other group. And then from there we can update the width settings. Now inside of this repeating group, what I've actually done is I've added 2 separate groups. So my repeating group is this whole element you see here. And inside of it, I've got 2 groups. There's my yellow group and then there's my green group. And the purpose of these is that within my yellow group, I'm just displaying the heading of each individual piece of data I'm going to show in my repeating group. Then in my green group, I'm displaying the actual data itself. So a person's contact name, their company name, and their phone number. And then what I'm going to do in a moment is show you how we can only display this yellow group in the very first cell of our repeating group. So that way it doesn't repeat itself throughout the whole list. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. But look, for now, I just wanted to highlight how this is built. So because I'm stacking 2 groups on top of each other, these are stacked vertically, which means that the container layout for my overall repeating group will need to be a column. So jumping back into my main bubble editor, I'm going to set the container layout here to be a column. I'm then now going to make this fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'm going to set the minimum width to be 0 and leave the maximum width as infinite. So this repeating group can take up as little or as much space as it needs. And now what we can do inside of this repeating group before we update any of the heights or the margin settings is add both of those groups in. So we're going to start with my yellow group, which displays all of the headings. So if we head to our containers menu, we're going to add a group inside of the very first cell of my repeating group. Now for this group, what I'm going to do first of all is jump to my appearance tab, detach the default style of this, and set the background style to be a flat color so I can make it a light shade of yellow, just so I can clearly see where it sits on my page. I'm also going to make this group fully responsive because I want it to take up the full width of my repeating group. So over in my layout tab here, first of all, I'll need to update the container layout. And when it comes to this, I'd like to display some text elements horizontally inside of it. So that means that the container layout will need to be a row. I can then make this fully responsive by unselecting that this element should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width to be 0, leave the maximum width as infinite. And now we can start to build out all of the elements inside of this. And so I'm just going to add 3 text elements into this group. So if I scroll on up here, I'm going to grab a text element. I'll add that into my yellow group. And for this text element, we're just going to type in the words contact name. I'm then going to scroll on down to my styling, detach the default style. I'm going to bold this text and also align it in the center. But I'm going to leave the font size as 14. I can then jump over to my layout tab because I'd like to make this text element fully responsive. So I'm going to unselect that this should be a fixed width. I'll set the minimum width as 0, leave the maximum width as infinite. I'll do the exact same thing for the height. I'll also vertically align this text in the center of my group. And then finally add 10 pixels of margin around every single border. Now to streamline the process of adding my 2 additional headings, I'm just going to make a copy of this text. Only for the next text element, instead of displaying contact name, I'm going to have this display the words company name. And then finally, we're going to make one last copy. And this is going to display the words contact number. And that is all we'll need to change here. We can then select on our yellow group because we've finished adding all of our text elements in. Then if we jump to our layout tab, I'm going to set the minimum height here to equal 0. And that's going to collapse perfectly around all of the elements that sit inside of it. And now below this group, what we can do is build out our next group. And instead of having to build that from scratch, what we can actually do is just make a copy of this existing yellow group. So I'm going to choose to make a copy of this, select in the first cell of my repeating group, and paste in another version. But the first thing I'm going to do for this group is just update the background color so I can easily distinguish between both of these groups. So if I jump to my appearance tab, I'm going to update the color of this to be a light shade of green. And when it comes to the contents of this group, I'd like to now actually display the contact name for each person, the company name, as well as their contact number. So how can I do that? If let's say our repeating group has a list of 3 different customers being displayed in it, what we can do is actually select on this text element and insert some dynamic data to display the information of each individual customer. However, the problem we have right now is that this text element doesn't actually sit inside of our repeating group. I mean, technically it kind of does, but it sits inside of our green group, which sits inside of our repeating group. So it's like one of those Russian dolls where it's got the layers. So in order to reference the information of the customer in each repeating group cell, which in cell number 1, it's going to display customer number 1. In cell number 2, customer number 2, and so on. What we need to do is actually send some data from our repeating group and store it inside of this green group. So if I quickly just digress and click on my green group, what I need to do is use another superpower of groups inside a bubble, and that is their ability to store data within them. And look, trust me, this is why groups are your best friend inside a bubble. So with this group here, what I can do is give it a type of content. And I'm going to tell this group, you're going to store the information of a customer. But of course, if this group wants to store the information of a customer, it needs to know which customer it should display. And in this case, I'm just going to reference the current cell's customer. So the current cell is the very first cell of our repeating group, or it might be the second cell or the third cell, whatever cell this group sits within. And then what can happen from here is if I click on my static text element, so my contact name, I can delete all of that static text, I can insert dynamic data, and I can reference the parent group's customer. So the parent group is the green group because our text element sits inside of that green group. So that green group is taking care of that text element. So it is its parent. So I'm going to reference the parent group's customer, and I'm just going to now pull their contact name. It's as simple as that. I'm also just going to choose to unbold this text. I don't really need it to stand out too much. And now after changing that, we can do the exact same thing for the company name. So I'm going to select on this text element, delete all this static text, insert dynamic data and reference the parent group's customer, their company name. I'm going to choose to unbold that. And then finally, we'll do the exact same thing for the contact number. So I'm going to remove the static text, insert dynamic data and reference the parent group's customer, the contact number, and we'll just unbold that text as well. And just like that, that is absolutely everything we need to build out within this green group. And because it concludes everything I wanted to add into our actual repeating group, what we can now do is just update the remaining layout settings of our repeating group itself. So things like the height and the margin. So if I select on our repeating group, which in order to do that, you just need to select anything that is not the first cell. And as you can see here, I'm viewing my repeating group customer. What I'm going to do is jump over to my layout tab and I'm going to set the minimum height to be 0. And because we have this default option selected to fit the height of this element to the content inside of it, it's going to collapse nicely around both of my groups. Now, although this repeating group is only displaying one cell now, rest assured it will display as many or as few as it needs to. So if you've got 10 customers, it will display 10. If you've got 2, it will display 2. And of course, if you've got 1, it will just display 1. While we're here though, what I'd also like to do is just add 20 pixels of margin around every single border for this repeating group. And that's just going to ensure it doesn't touch the borders of my overall group there. Now, another thing we'll need to do with this repeating group is create a way to have it reflect the information someone puts into this input field. So for instance, if you wanted to search for a particular customer by their name, you'd be able to type that into this input field. And I'd like this repeating group to update and automatically reflect that. So that way it only displays the customer with the same name as what someone has typed out here. So how can we do that? What we can do is actually create a condition on our repeating group. And within that condition, we can recognize when someone has in fact typed something into this input field. We can update the data source and display all of the customers that not only belong to a company, but also have the same contact name or company name as what someone has typed in here. So under our property editor for our repeating group, we're going to open up our conditional tab and we're just going to recognize when this input here, so when the input customer search, when its value is not empty, meaning that someone has actually typed something into it. What I'm going to do is update the data source for this repeating group. And instead of having to write that data source from scratch, what I'm going to do is jump over to my appearance tab here and right click on my existing data source and copy that expression. I'm then going to jump to my conditional tab, right click here and paste that expression. And then if I click on this, I'm going to open up the search here. And all I need to do is add an additional constraint. So a constraint is like a filter. And I'm going to say search for all of the customers that belong to our business, but also have, let's say, a contact name. Now you can choose company name or contact name. I'm going to go with contact name that equals or contains even the keywords that have been typed into this input field. So I'm going to type in the word search and I'm going to reference the input customer search, its value there. And that is all I will need to change. Another nice feature I'd like to add to my repeating group is that when someone hovers over each cell, what I'd like to do is change the background color for that specific entry, just so it's clear where your mouse is and where you're going to click. So what I'm going to do is select on my green group here. So this is my group that contains my dynamic customer information. And I'm going to create a condition and I'm just going to recognize when this group is hovered. So if I select this, this is just going to recognize when someone has their mouse over this group. And when this condition is true, what I'm going to do is update the background color of this group. And I'm going to make it a shade of green here, but I'm also just going to set the opacity to be 20. Now, if you'd like this color code that I'm going to use, it's 2CA01C. And if I wanted to see what this is going to look like when someone hovers over this group, I can easily just toggle this condition on and off here. So it's going to become this exact color. So that way it's now clear that this is the group I'm about to select. Now look, this isn't necessarily an essential feature, but it's more of a nice thing to have if you want to create a nice end user experience. Now look, that's everything we need to build out for this condition here, but there's still a few minor tweaks I need to make to my repeating group. So if I want to select my repeating group, what you'll notice is that if I click on it, I can only access my group that sits inside of it. So in order to access my repeating group, I need to right click on that green group and select its first parent. because if you remember, this green group sits inside of my repeating group. So the repeating group is the parent. I can then jump over to my appearance tab. And one thing I'd like to do here is just make sure I set the minimum height of each row to also be 0. So that just means that it's really going to ensure that this repeating group collapses around all of the content inside of it. And look, there is one last change I want to make to my repeating group, but we're not going to do that right now. I'm going to show you a preview of this before we make any additional changes. But before we get to that preview, we just need to finish building out this white group here. So once we've finished adding all of our elements into this section of our page, we're going to select on this white group, so my group customers, and we can now jump over to my layout tab and first of all set the minimum height to be 0, which is just going to make sure it collapses around all of my elements inside of it there. While we're here, we're also just going to scroll on down to our margins and add 20 pixels of margin around every single border so it doesn't touch the borders of my page. And then finally, we need to create the experience that's either going to show or hide this group. So if you remember in my example before, when I'd shown you a preview of an existing QuickBooks product I created, this group was actually hidden until we selected it from the menu. So if I quickly just jump back into my separate browser, I'm just going to quickly show you a preview here. So by default, whenever you open up your dashboard, I'm going to today create an experience that displays some visualizations. However, when you select on customers here, I want this group to be shown and any other group to be hidden. So that's the kind of functionality we need to build out right now. And this is where things are going to get slightly more complex if you are brand new to Bubble. So what we need to do is essentially create a way to recognize which group should be shown. First of all, once the page is loaded, and of course, as we click through all of the options here. So you can see when I click on my expenses, I want this group to be shown. When I click on my customers, I want that group to be shown. And when I click on my dashboard, I want the overview to be shown. So we need some sort of way to recognize which group should be shown at any given point in time. And thankfully, Bubble has a feature that makes that easy for us. And that feature is known as a custom state. Now, if you've never heard of what a custom state is in your entire life, that is completely fine. Essentially, a custom state is a way of just temporarily storing some data inside your page. So instead of storing data in your database, you have the ability to store it on your page. Now, there's pros and cons to doing things like that. One of the major drawbacks is that every single time you refresh your page, data will just be reset as well, which look is completely fine in our example today. Because whenever someone loads this page, we're going to want to take them to the dashboard section regardless. But one of the main benefits to custom states is that you don't constantly have to store information in your database that isn't necessary. So if we were storing which section of our application someone was going to view anytime they use our app, we're just going to be storing a lot of unnecessary data inside our database. So it's going to quickly slow things down, and instead there's an easier way to do it by using a custom state. Now look, I'm going to walk you through the process of creating a custom state, and what you'll find is that it's very similar to the process of creating data fields in your database, because you're essentially just creating a data field that sits on your page, not in your database. So let's jump back over into our main Bubble editor here. And what we need to do is select on our overall page. So if I double click on my red group here, then right click on it and select its first parent, what you'll see is we now have our dashboard, which is our overall page. Now at the top of our property editor here, you'll see this little information icon, which is just hiding in plain sight. And look, I really think it doesn't get enough credit. When you select this, it's going to open up the back door to Narnia. This is where you can store custom states. So we're going to choose to create a new custom state here. And in fact, I'm not going to just create one, I'm going to create a couple. I'm going to create a custom state for each individual menu option here. So there should be 4 in total. And these are the 4 different groups I'm going to display in the content area of my page. So there's going to be my overview where I display data. There's my customers where I display customers, one for my expenses and one for my invoices. So I'm actually going to create all 4 of those custom states right now. And as I mentioned before, when you select to create a custom state, this looks exactly the same as when you create a data field in your database. And that's because you essentially are. You're just creating a way to store some data temporarily inside of your page, not within your database. So for this state, what I'm going to call this is display data. So this is going to display our data visualizations. Now for the state type, I'm just going to set this as a yes/no value, because I either do want to display that section of our page or I don't. I'm going to choose to create this here. Now what I'm going to do is actually set the default value here to equal yes, So that way, as soon as someone loads their dashboard, this is the group and the section of our page that is going to be shown to them. I'm then going to create the next custom state, and this is going to be called display customers. Once again, this state type is going to be a yes/no field. I'm going to create this. Only this time, I'm going to set the default value to equal no, because I don't want this section of our page to be shown as soon as the dashboard is loaded. I'm only going to set the value of this to equal yes when someone clicks on this navigation option here. But now we need to create 2 more additional states for our last 2 options. So I'm going to create another state. This will be called display expenses. Once again, it will be a yes/no type. I'll create that, and I'll also set its default value to be no. And then finally, I'm going to select display invoices. I'm going to set this as a yes/no type. I'll create that, and once again, the default value will equal no. Now look, that is everything we need to create when it comes to our custom states here. However, what we actually need to do now is create the workflow that's going to run when someone clicks on this customers text, because we'll need to update the custom state in our page. So I want to set it to equal yes. So I'm going to click on this customers text, open up my appearance tab, and choose to add a workflow here. And within this workflow, I'm just going to do one simple step. I'm going to type in the word state, and I'm going to set the state of an element. The element is our overall dashboard page. And for this page, what I'm going to need to do is update the state of all 4 options. So if you remember, by default, we had the display data state set as yes, and all of the others were no. So what I'm going to do now is set the display customer state as yes, and then I'm going to set all of the other states to equal no. So for the display data state, that will be no. For the display expenses state, that will also be no. And then finally, for the display invoices state, once again, that will be no. And look, that is all we need to do within this workflow. We don't need to add any additional steps. The last thing we could do though is just update the color of this workflow trigger. Now look, I'm torn because technically this does sit within my navigation menu, so it could be blue, but it's also related to my customer CRM feature, so it could also be green. So I'm going to leave this up to your interpretation, but look, I'm going to make this green for the sake of our tutorial today. Now, if I jump back into my design tab, and if I run a preview of my application, what you're going to see is that it's not quite displaying this group yet by default. Or I should actually say that it is displaying this group and it actually shouldn't be displaying this group. So if you remember, as I mentioned, when this page is loaded by default, I only want to display the data visualizations, not my customers. It's only when someone clicks on this customers text that this group should be shown. So what I need to do is create a condition on this group to hide it by default, and then recognize that when the custom state, which displays our customers, is set to yes, this group should be shown. So let's jump back into Bubble here, select on my group, and from here, we're going to open up our layout tab, and we're actually going to uncheck this option to make this element visible on page load. I'm also going to tick this option to collapse this element when it's hidden, so that way it doesn't take up any empty space on our page. And then finally, we'll open up our conditional tab and now create that condition. So within this condition, we're just going to recognize when the custom state in our dashboard page is set to yes. So I'm going to type in the word dashboard, and I'm going to reference the overall page. And right at the bottom, you're going to see all of our custom states. So I'm going to reference when the dashboard page's display customers custom state is in fact yes. What I'd like to do is select that this element should be visible and tick that that should be true. And if we were to now run a preview of our app again and refresh the page, what you're going to see is that this group is not shown by default. Instead, it will only be shown when we click the customers option from our menu here. And of course, now as you'll see, this group is being displayed and our repeating group is displaying the information of all of our customers, which we currently just have one. Now there is one last thing I need to show you before we wrap up this module, and that is if I was to add another customer here. So if I display our pop-up, what I'm going to do is just add an example of a customer. I'm going to call her Tracy Shaw. She works for Shaw & Co. Her email is tracy@shaw.co, and I'm just going to put a random contact number. Now, when I hit save on this, what you'll see is that it'll add it to our repeating group, which is great. I want that to be the case. However, both our yellow group and our green group are currently being displayed. Whereas I only want the yellow group to really be shown in the very first cell of our repeating group. I don't need it to be shown every single time because I know that this is where the contact name will be, this is where the company name will be, and that is where the phone number will be. So what I actually need to do is create some sort of condition on that yellow group that only allows it to be displayed in the very first cell of our repeating group. And look, thankfully, that is super straightforward. Let's jump back into Bubble here, select on our yellow group, and what we're going to do is define a new condition, and we're just going to recognize when the current cell's index is 1. So essentially what that means is that when the current cell of our repeating group is cell number 1, if it's cell number 2, 3, or anything else, this condition will not be true. And when this condition is true, so when we are currently viewing cell number 1 of our repeating group, I'd like this element to be visible. So I'm going to leave that ticked. But then what I'm going to do is jump to my layout tab and unselect that should be visible by default. So it's only going to display it in cell number 1. And I'm also going to tick this choice to collapse this element when it's hidden. So that way it doesn't take up any empty space. Now, if I jump back to the preview and refresh my page here, what you'll see is that when I open up my customers portal, what you'll now see is that the yellow group is only being displayed in the very first cell. So it creates that exact user experience we were looking for. But look, at this point in time, that's everything I wanted to cover within this module. What we'll do from here though is just jump back into our Notion checklist and we can tick off that we've finished building out this section to create almost like our CRM where we're displaying all of the details of a customer. And now look, between adding the repeating group and sorting out all of the custom states, there was quite a bit in this module, but look, thankfully it wasn't anything we couldn't handle inside of Bubble. Scrolling through our list of features, the last thing I want to work on when it comes to our CRM feature inside of our Quickbooks clone today is just being able to view the existing details of a customer and of course make changes to those. So if you ever want to update a customer's contact number or perhaps the company they work for, this is where you'll be able to do that. Now, look, in my opinion, this module is pretty straightforward, but before we dive into it, what I'd like to do is show you a preview of how this whole experience is going to function in our actual live app. So what we're going to do is jump over into a separate browser here, and over in a preview of my existing QuickBooks clone, what you'll see is that we've got our CRM view here, which is just displaying our customers. And when I click on one of these customers here, it just opens up the pop-up that we already built before. So this is the pop-up where you can actually create a new customer. However, what you will notice here is that all of the information of the customer that I've just selected has been pre-filled in all of these fields. So I'm sending some data through to this pop-up and I'm displaying it within it. Now, if I was to make any changes here, let's say I want to update the contact name for John. I'm going to call this John Williams. And I'm going to choose to then save this. What you'll notice is that a workflow is going to run and it's going to update that data in our database. It's then going to close our pop-up and that change has automatically been applied to John's account. So look, as you saw, there's not a whole lot happening in terms of what we have to build, but there are a few little specific nuances that we need to watch out for at the end of this module. But I'll be sure to explain those once we get there. So let's start by jumping over to our main Bubble editor and we're going to open up our dashboard page. Now, within this page, we're going to open up the group that displays our customers. So this is exactly what you see here. Now, whenever this green group is clicked, with all of the customer information inside of it that sits inside our overall repeating group, what I'd like to do is obviously display our pop-up and then display this user's information inside of it. So what I'm going to do is double click on this green group. I'm going to jump to my appearance tab and I'm going to choose to add a workflow whenever this is clicked. Then within this workflow, I'm going to show an element, and that element is going to be my pop-up. So what I'm going to do is add a step here. I'm going to select from my element actions. I'm going to choose to show an element, and of course, that element is my pop-up. Now, I'm not going to update the workflow color right now because we're not done with this workflow. What would currently happen within this existing workflow is that we would select on a customer's name and our pop-up would be shown, but nothing else would happen. Their information wouldn't be stored within these input fields. So what we actually need to do is create a way to store some data inside of this pop-up. Now, if you remember, when we built out this pop-up, I'd mentioned that pop-ups function just like groups. However, they're hidden by default, and then they display when you call them within a workflow. Now, because a pop-up is essentially a group, if we were to double click on this, under our appearance tab here, you'll see the ability to store some data inside of this pop-up. So for the type of content I'd like to store, I'm going to store the value of a customer. And then when it comes to the data source, well, I don't really know which customer I want to display inside of this. I'm only going to know which customer it is whenever I click them within my list of all the customers in my CRM. So I'm not going to be able to add a data source here because, as I mentioned, I don't know which specific customer to display yet. However, what we can do is within the workflow that we just created when this green group was clicked, what we could do is send some data of this specific customer and store it in our pop-up. So if I double click on my green group again, I'm going to edit that existing workflow. And within this workflow, if we head to our element actions, what I'm going to do is choose this option to display data. And the element I'm going to send and display data into is going to be the pop-up customer. And now because I've set the content type to be a customer within my pop-up, I'm going to have to send through the value of a customer that I want to send and display in it. So the data I'll be sending to display is just going to be the current sales customer. It's super straightforward. What I am just going to do though is switch these steps in my workflow around. So I'll only want my pop-up to show once we've successfully sent the data of this user, or the customer I should say, into the pop-up. I don't want the pop-up to show and have nothing in there and then take a little bit of time to actually process the data it's sending and displaying. So I'm going to do that first in my workflow, and then I'm going to actually show that pop-up. Now, because this workflow is related to my customer CRM feature, I'm going to select on the workflow trigger here, and I'm going to set the event color to be green. Now, if we jump back over into our pop-up, so I'm just going to quickly close my property editor, head to my elements tree, and I'm going to display my pop-up customer. What I'd like to do is actually display some initial content in all of these input fields, which is going to display the details of the customer that we've stored inside of our pop-up here. So if I click on our first field here, what I'm going to do is select on my very first input field, and under the initial content, I'm going to insert dynamic data, and I'm going to display the parent group's customer. So the parent group's customer is the customer that we just sent within our workflow. And I'm going to reference their contact name here. Now, the beauty of initial content is that if we haven't sent through the data of a customer, this just won't display. So if we're creating a brand new customer from scratch, don't stress because no information is going to be displayed here. Instead, it's going to revert back to our placeholder text and just display the words type here. We'll then do the exact same thing for the company name. I'm going to insert dynamic data and reference the parent group's customer, the company name. Same thing for the contact email. So I'm going to pull the parent group's customer, their contact email, and then finally we'll do the exact same thing for the contact number. So we'll insert dynamic data and reference the parent group's customer, the contact number there. Perfect. Now the other thing we'll need to do is build out a separate workflow that's going to run whenever this save button is clicked. Because instead of creating a new customer, what I'd like to do is actually make changes to an existing customer. So if I was to click on the save button and choose to edit the workflow, as you'll see, we already have an existing workflow here that's creating a new customer. So what I need to do is actually create a brand new workflow from scratch. So I'm going to head to my workflow event here, and I'm going to set the trigger should run when an element is clicked. That element will of course be my button save, which is the exact same trigger as my previous workflow. Only within this workflow, I'm not going to create a new thing. I'm going to make changes to an existing thing. So if I head to my workflow actions, we're going to open up our data tab and we're going to choose to make changes to a thing. Now the thing we're going to change is once again the parent group's customer. So that is the customer that we've stored within our pop-up. And all we'll need to change is of course all of the data fields that match the input fields on our pop-up. So for the company name, I'm going to set this to be the value of the input, customer company name. And look, this is much the same as the process as when we created a customer. But of course, it's just going to update any changes that have been made to each of these input fields. So for the contact email, I'm going to type in the word email and reference the input customer email. Then for the contact name, this will be the input customer contact name. And then finally for the contact number, I'm just going to have this be the input customer phone number. Now we won't need to change the original business field because at this point in time, the customer has already been linked to a business. So we don't need to relink that. It's already been done. So I'm going to delete that field there. And look, the beauty of this workflow step is that it's going to update every single field. However, if you were to, let's say, only update the contact name and nothing else, all of these additional fields would still update. But if it matches the exact same value of what's already stored in your database, nothing's going to change for those fields. So it's going to retain all the same information. Now look, after we've taken the time to update the customer's details, we're going to need to hide our pop-up again. So what I'm going to do is add an additional step here, and I'm going to head on down to my element actions, and I'm going to choose to hide an element. And this is just going to close our pop-up. So the element I'm going to hide is going to be the pop-up customer. And then finally, I'd like to reset all of my input fields. So that way, if I was to, let's say, want to create a new customer and my pop-up displays again, I don't want all of this existing customer's details to still be displayed within my input fields. So if I just type in the word reset, I'm going to choose the step to reset relevant inputs, and that's all we'll need to create. Now look, after building out all of the steps in this workflow, we can select on the workflow trigger and update the event color to be green, because once again, this is related to our customer CRM feature. However, there's just something important that I need to note. And if you remember at the start of this module, I said there was a small little nuance detail that we need to pay attention to. This is it right now. So at this point in time, both of these workflows have the exact same trigger. So even if you wanted to create a new customer and you hit this save button, both of these workflows are going to run. So it's going to create the customer, hide the pop-up, and reset the input fields. But at the same time, it's also going to run this workflow to make changes to an existing customer. So Bubble's going to be very confused. In reality, we should only have one of these workflows running at once. So how can we differentiate between these? In this case here, for the workflow where we're going to make changes to an existing customer, in theory, I should only want that to run when a customer's details are stored within my pop-up here. So in theory, what I could do is just recognize when the customer content type does have a value. So when it's not empty, I could run a separate workflow that updates the details of that customer at that point in time. So within my workflow tab, I'm going to select on my workflow trigger here. And what I'm actually going to do is create a condition on this workflow. So I'm only going to allow this to run when the parent group's customer is not empty. So if I scroll on down, I'm going to select this option that is not empty, meaning that we are updating the details of an existing customer. Then what we'll also need to do is create the inverse condition on the existing workflow where we're creating a customer. So if we're not storing the details of a customer in that pop-up, we obviously don't want to make changes to an existing customer. Instead, we'll want to create a new customer. So I'm going to select on our very first workflow trigger here, and I'm going to add a similar condition. So with this condition, I'm going to recognize when the parent group's customer, when this field is in fact empty, this workflow here should run. And thankfully, that is all we'll need to change when it comes to these two workflows here. And right now, we should have a fully functional feature, which is going to allow us to update the details of an existing customer. There is just one additional thing we'll need to pick up on later. However, let's just quickly run a preview of this and I'll show you what we've built so far. Over in a preview of my app here, what I'm going to do is select on Tracy Shaw here. I can see that when I typed her name in, I had a typo because there's a capital H. So what I'm going to do is just select on her name and I'm just going to fix that. I'll choose to save this. This pop-up's going to close. And of course, as you can see, that change has been updated in our database and it now reflects our list here. Now, let's say from here, if I wanted to edit the details of John Smith, what you'll notice is that when I click on John's account, it's going to display our pop-up and also display his details. So that works perfect. If I was to close this pop-up, however, and now select to add a new customer, what you're gonna see is that John's details are still being displayed in here. And so why is that? It's because we've technically stored a data type in our pop-up here. And although we actually closed our pop-up, that piece of data we've stored in it is still sitting inside of it. So that's why the initial content is being displayed. And so this was that last little nuance that I mentioned that we just need to cater for. And so how can we fix this? Thankfully, it's a super straightforward process. All we need to do is jump back into our bubble editor, close our pop-up here, and just adjust the workflows that display the pop-up whenever a button is clicked to create a new customer. And so what we're going to do is select on our button here first, and I'm going to choose to edit this existing workflow. Now, before we show this pop-up, what I'm going to do is add an additional step. And within our element actions, I'm going to choose this option to reset data. And the element I'd like to reset the data for is, of course, going to be our pop-up customer. So that now means that if there's the data of a customer stored in this pop-up, it's just going to wipe that out. So it's going to remove that. Now, I'd like to move this to the first step in my workflow. So that way, before the pop-up is shown, I'm resetting the customer inside of it. And that's all we need to change here. However, of course, this isn't the only place that you can create a new customer. If we jump into our design tab, you might remember that we had this drop-down menu within our main navigation menu. And of course, within that, we had this text that displayed the words new customer. Now, what we'll need to do is edit this workflow as well and make the exact same change. So I'm going to head to my element actions, choose to reset data, and the data I'll be resetting is going to be under our pop-up customer. And then I'm just going to move this to step 1 within my workflow. Now, if we jump back to the preview of our app and just refresh this page here, what I'm going to do is select on John Smith. It will obviously send the data of his customer account to my pop-up. It's going to store that there. When I then close this pop-up to select this button to create a new customer, as you'll see, it's going to reset the value of this pop-up. But if I was to click away and then open up Tracy's account, once again, we're going to be sending the data of a customer back into it. So you can really see how easy it is to send and display data inside of groups or pop-ups within Bubble. From here though, what we're going to do is just jump back into our Notion checklist because we've finished building out the very last feature for the CRM section of our QuickBooks clone today. And it's super exciting to start to see some of the core functionality come to life. And just like that, that is all I have time to include within this tutorial today. As you can see, we've been building for literally hours and there's still so many features that I need to uncover in as much detail as possible. Now, if you wanted to get access to the entire course where I build out this full QuickBooks clone, I'd always recommend hitting the link in the description of this video so that way you can get access. Now, while that full course is going to cost you money, I'm confident that it's going to save you months of your life having to learn how to rebuild each of these features from scratch. So if you really want to launch your app as quickly as possible, it's going to be worth your time to check that out. Throughout that full course, I'm going to teach you things like how you can create your own user registration page, your own user settings page where you can invite members to a team, a way to create and display expenses, a way to create and display invoices, how you can then generate PDF versions of an invoice that of course you can email to a customer, and how we can visualize all of the data within a business inside of your QuickBooks dashboard. I truly wasn't lying when I said there's still so many features that I need to walk through. If you wanted to stay up to date with any additional Bubble resources I share though, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button on my channel so that way you can be the first to know whenever I drop a new tutorial. In the meantime though, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for watching this entire video today, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.